Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 961. Adam is one step closer to being divine. Such a simple sentence instantly sent tumultuous waves through every member of the Tarot Club. Other than Leonard, the other members, including Zio, who had been briefed of the important points by the magician, immediately recalled the information regarding Adam. Ancient sun god, city of Silver's creator's son, brother of blasphemer Ammon. Suspected to be one of the 8 kings of angels. And this mythical figure, who had existed before the cataclysm, had become active in the real world once again. And he was one step closer to being divine. This, to make Mr. Fool sigh, it means that Adam is probably just one step short of reaching the divine throne, sequence 0. There's a chance that he might make that step at any moment. Alger subconsciously came to a conclusion as he hurriedly clasped his hands and couldn't help but have thoughts run through his mind. A sequence 0 true God is about to be born. There are still births of true gods in the 5th epoch. This will be the first true god this epoch. With deities no longer able to descend upon the real world, it's unbelievable that a sequence 0 would still appear. Alger always found himself ambitious, with him now setting his sights on sequence 2, to become an angel. But after hearing about Adam, he still found it unacceptable. One had to know that the last one to become a sequence 0 true god was the former god of craftsmanship, the present god of steam and machinery. And that happened in the late 4th epoch. Since the 5th epoch, over 1300 years, there hadn't been any new existence reaching the divine throne. It's no wonder Mr. Fool said that the times will change as a result. Amidst Catlea's scattered thoughts, she suddenly came to a realization as though she could see the waves that marked the end of an epoch flooding over. Having already gathered the ingredients and being in the process of making preparations for the sequence for ritual, she believed she had the chance of attaining divinity in the near future to change her existence. She was still reeling in joy, anticipation, and unease. But at this moment, she suddenly felt a baffling sense of horror. All she wanted was to communicate with Queen Mystic face to face to confirm the future. Force, Zio, and the other members had a myriad of reactions. On the one hand, they were shocked that Adam was attempting to achieve divinity, never expecting such a matter to happen in the 5th epoch. On the other hand, they were worried for their present life. After all, be it Emlyn from the Sanguine, or Audrey who lived amongst the Lun Kingdom's upper class, all of them lived in the 5th epoch, living in a situation which had more than 1,000 years of history setting the foundation. They didn't dare have any sacrilegious thoughts towards true gods. Even when facing evil gods like the true creator, they still felt a deep sense of fear and awe, acknowledging their level and loftiness. Therefore, they couldn't believe that a god would soon appear. They couldn't imagine what would happen next. In their eyes, the Fool was a reawakened ancient god, an existence who originally sat at the throne of sequence 0. One step closer to being divine. Becoming a god. Derek was mostly excited, as though he could see hope and have a target to strive for. To him, only a sequence 0 could save the city of Silver. Adam? Becoming a god. Although Leonard didn't know who Adam was, just the simple words of being one step closer to being divine was easy to understand. He connected it to that ordinary priest who had appeared after the battle ended and had picked up 0-08 in front of Klein. That's Adam? Or a subordinate of Adam? No, 0-08 is a grade 0 sealed artifact. Only Adam, who's very close to the divine throne, can do it personally with great certainty. It's no wonder the battle within Zangwill was easier than I expected. I thought the best outcome would be me and Klein dragging Zangwill into hell together. Who's Adam? Why haven't I heard of him? Perhaps a result of being parasitized by an angel, allowing him to know some of the secrets and developments of the 4th epoch, Leonard had a deeper understanding of Adam's path to being divine. The impact he felt wasn't too great, with most of his feelings puzzlement and curiosity over Adam's true identity. And at this moment, the Fool didn't speak again or give further explanations. It was as though he was simply warning the members to make preparations for the change of the times. Amidst the confusion and wandering thoughts, the world-German Sparrow glanced at the star Leonard and simply said, Adam is the son of the ancient sun god, blasphemer Ammon's brother. Leonard immediately jumped in fright and failed to control his expression. He had a deep impression of Amon, and he had a deep trauma for Amon because of Old Man's descriptions. And Adam was Amon's brother, so it was very possible that the level of horror was likely the same between the two brothers. The world ignored the star's reaction and continued. It can be confirmed now that Adam is one of the 8 kings of angels, titled Angel of Imagination. He is ranked on par with Angel of Time Amon. The reason for him targeting Int Zangwill is to obtain 0-08 to make up any shortfalls for his path to being divine. And his plan succeeded. Angel of Imagination. Adam is a king of angels from the spectator pathway. Audrey instantly connected this to the Dragon King Ankwelt's title, Dragon of Imagination. And she had long known that mind dragons represented the spectator pathway. As for Leonard, another comprehension obstacle appeared before him. He had been stumped by the concept of a king of angels, but he was too embarrassed to ask. He had planned on seeking Old Man's help when he awakened. Alger pondered over German Sparrow's words as his expression turned slightly odd. He probed, "You seem to have witnessed the matter?" Just as he said that, all of them heard a familiar, hoarse laughter. After German Sparrow finished laughing, he looked at the star and said as though it was nothing, "The murder of Int Zangwill was committed by me and my partner." Katlea's mind instantly went blank. She could accept that German Sparrow could easily finish off Admiral Hell, but she couldn't imagine that he would one day kill a real sequence for demigod. Katlea quickly calmed down because, with a king of angels involved in the battle, it was possible that a sequence 5 could kill off a heavily injured demigod due to various coincidences. Furthermore, he had a partner. Audrey read confidence from the world's tone. She couldn't help but ask out of curiosity, "Mr. World, have you already become a demigod?" The world didn't give a direct answer as he chuckled. "In the future, all of you can entrust matters involving demigods to me." Every member present figured out the meaning in between the lines. He had become a genuine sequence for demigod. Furthermore, he was the kind who had the ability to kill peers at his level. At that instant, Katlea became abnormally calm. She tried hard to recall everything that she had seen and heard regarding German Sparrow. She was very certain that he was only a sequence 6 before the visit to the ruins of the battlefield of gods. He relied on the glove to match a sequence 5. As for German Sparrow's search for mermaids without hunting any of them, it implied that it was a requirement of a ritual. This meant that he had indeed advanced to sequence 5 back then. His various performances after that proved this point. Today, it had only been about 3 months since German Sparrow stepped into the ruins of the battlefield of the gods, but he had already advanced to sequence 4, becoming a demigod existence. This overturned Katlea's understanding of the world. She wasn't too old, with her age being less than 30. But to reach sequence 5 and gain the title of Admiral of Stars, it took her about 7 to 8 years. It was only in the past 1 or 2 years did she have the confidence to attempt to breach the gate to become a demigod. With her starting to make preparations, she believed she was already far ahead of the pack. Mr. World is impressive. He became a demigod so quickly. Derek sincerely felt joy. His idolization for Mr. World grew more intense as he hoped that he could be like him, becoming a demigod at the fastest speed possible. Audrey was both alarmed and delighted. Following that, she gained an understanding towards the abnormality in German Sparrow's mental state. Explore new novels on novelbin.com. From the looks of it, his low spirits, gloomy, and depressed feelings happened after he became a demigod. These are the negative effects accumulated from potions. It's just like how I nearly lost control when I became a psychiatrist. Also, after becoming a sequence 4 and gaining godhood, he could naturally penetrate more of reality. He then realized that he had been sleeping for a very long time. His family had passed away, making him lose his goals. How pitiful. With his warm nature, he must have had deep feelings for his family and friends. However, I'm so envious. Does being Mr. Fool's blessed make one advance so quickly? I also wish to become a demigod early. Mr. Fool's mention that the times have changed as a result leaves me fretting. While Emlyn and the other members were still in shock, Alger, who also shared the same feelings and felt deep envy and jealousy towards German Sparrow, had other thoughts. As Mr. Fool's blessed, German Sparrow's embroilment with this King of Angels and 0-08 matter clearly isn't an accident. On the contrary, it might be more reasonable that it's a mutual plan between Angel of Imagination Adam and Mr. Fool. That will explain it. Two mythical figures that existed before the cataclysm. One is awakening, and the other is making an advancement, the two secretly coming together. Amidst his thoughts, Alger had another idea. Since Adam had obtained 0-08 and opened the door to the divine throne, what about Mr. Fool? What benefit did he get in this matter? Subconsciously, Alger turned his body and slightly bowed his head to look at the seat of honor. He didn't dare look directly, and could only look through the corner of his eye. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 962. Almost instantly, Alger discovered that Mr. Fool was somewhat different than before. In the past, although Mr. Fool was distant and profound, making him appear unfathomable, as though he was looking down upon everything from above, that was all. It wasn't like he was now. Even though he wasn't doing anything, he seemed to have fused with the entire space, a clear expression of him being the ruler at the pinnacle level. Sweeping his gaze, Alger saw the third card of blasphemy as he felt more certain of his guess. Indeed, Mr. Fool and the Angel of Imagination Adam had cooperated to machinate in Zangwill's demise. One of them obtained 0-08, making him take one step closer to being a god, while the other obtained the various benefits in a card of blasphemy and regained a substantial amount of his strength. The times will change as a result. At that instant, Alger had a deeper understanding of what Mr. Fool had just said. The other members undoubtedly noticed him turning his head, and they realized that he was looking at Mr. Fool. After a brief moment of surprise, they made a certain realization at different speeds. Mr. Fool was aware of Angel of Imagination Adam's plot against Int Zangwill from the very beginning and had sent his blessed to cooperate. He had even provided a certain level of help. If that weren't the case, how could a recently advanced demigod participate in a matter that involved a King of Angels and Grade O sealed artifact? If this weren't the case, the world wouldn't have been able to understand the situation that well, even if he had been embroiled due to all kinds of coincidences. The obtaining of the card of blasphemy, Mr. World's advancement, Int Zangwill's death, the meeting of Angel of Imagination Adam's goal, these all happened in 1 week. This means that the relationship between them is tightly intertwined. My previous intuition was right. The obtaining of a new card of blasphemy and the appearance of an abnormality in Mr. World's mental state were the different outcomes of the same matter. Audrey nodded very slightly as she confirmed her theory. Leonard was increasingly convinced that Int Zangwill's matter was more complicated than he had imagined. Apart from King of Angels Adam, there were likely other important figures of similar levels appearing back then. Otherwise, Amon's brother, the son of the ancient sun god, had no need to seek out Mr. Fool's help. After all, no matter how powerful or terrifying 0-08 was, it was incapable of comparing with the blasphemer as described by Old Man, as Adam and Amon were likely on par with each other. The evil spirit that Klein pulled into the underworld probably isn't simple. It's definitely not something that being from the Hunter pathway would be enough to describe it with. Klein's participation in the matter regarding Int Zangwill isn't solely for revenge, but is also due to Mr. Fool's orders. As Leonard sighed, he didn't generate any negative feelings. Instead, he was secretly relieved. From his point of view, this was a very ordinary situation. Mr. Fool's agreement in convening such a gathering to establish a corresponding organization while hosting it as a deity was definitely not because he solely wished to make the area more lively or being done out of goodwill. He definitely had his goals and needs that he wished blessed like Klein or members like him could complete. Therefore, seeking revenge on Int Zangwill and accepting Mr. Fool's mission wasn't in conflict. The latter didn't reduce the former's meaning and importance. As for why he was relieved, it was because Leonard believed that Mr. Fool's clear expression of his goals had made it better than having everything chaotic and unknown. He didn't need to guess or wait with trepidation. He originally had intense wariness for Pallas Zoroast precisely because he wasn't sure of his true motives. At this moment, the fool Klein didn't say a word. He didn't confirm or deny the members' guesses and theories. controlling the world, he made him continue. Adam might have established a very secretive organization, and it has been secretly steering the development of the times. Many important figures you might never have expected are members of this organization. They would machinate one matter after another. Also, after leaving this place, do not say or write down Adam's name, including his title. Try not to think about such matters, because he has the trait of any mention of it will be known. The more you know about him, the more he might know about you. This is somewhat similar to 0-08. After hearing Mr. World's description, Audrey instantly recalled learning of the mysterious organization from Mr. Fool, the Twilight Hermit Order. This made her quickly come up with a corresponding theory. The King of Angels, Adam, was the leader of the Twilight Hermit Order. The Angel of Imagination was a member of the Spectator Pathway. Likewise for 0-08. Therefore, any mention of it will be known was beyond a power of this pathway at higher sequences. Likewise for the more you know of it, the more it knows of you. Impressive. But won't this be rather noisy? Audrey momentarily looked forward to it with envy while also feeling worried and puzzled. Any mention of it will be known. So the organization behind the assassination of Duke Negan, the one backer behind Chilangos, was established by King of Angels Adam. Alger was first somewhat enlightened before his expression fell. He began to suspect that the primitive island that he had previously explored was related to this secret organization. This was because Chilangos had once ventured deep into it and discovered several items. Furthermore, the final disappearance of the island had resembled the powers of the Dragon of Imagination as described by the Sun. Putting the two together, Alger couldn't help but come up with such a theory as he made a deeper realization that Mr. Fool's cooperation with the Angel of Imagination had started when he and German Sparrow stepped into that primitive island. He was more convinced that it was the truth because after the existence in that island's ruin awakened, the only thing that happened was a sigh. He and German Sparrow weren't stopped from leaving. So that's how it is. The way important figures set up their ploys are truly well concealed. I didn't notice it at all back then. The games between gods are truly complicated. Perhaps only Sequence 1 Beyond Us or even King of Angels are qualified to participate. Alger sighed as he felt a baffling sense of desire. Force had already forgotten the mysterious organization which Mr. Fool had mentioned previously. Only when she heard any mention of it will be known did she recall that it was related to Duke Negan's assassination. However, she wasn't concerned about this problem, but something else. Back when she was informing Zio about the general situation of the Tarot Club and the general knowledge, she had mentioned Adam's name. Adam has the trait of any mention will be known? This? Zio and I are known by him? Force instantly felt horrified as she couldn't help but turn her head and cast her gaze to Zio. She had learned that Adam was the son of the creator from Hermit. Furthermore, she had never emphasized to not mention the King of Angels' name in the outside world. I've mentioned Adam in the real world, Force said with a clear stammer. Zio's nerves were taut as though a venomous snake had crawled into her clothes and was sliding across her back. Katlia tersely acknowledged. No need to worry. Although not many people know of Adam and Amorn, there's no lack of them. I've mentioned his name on several occasions. As long as the words you mentioned doesn't involve any secrets, I believe he will only observe you for a moment before casting his gaze elsewhere. She was rather certain when saying that because, in the Moses ascetic order that had been pursued by knowledge, Adam's existence wasn't a secret. People often mentioned him. At this moment, her mind was filled with another matter. Could it be that the secret, ancient organization that Emperor Razel joined was the one that King of Angels Adam established? Force hurriedly tried recalling and said somewhat hesitantly, there were mentions involving the Forsaken Land of the Gods, the Giant King's Court, Amorn, King of Angels, and other knowledge. Would that be a problem? She was very happy that she had never mentioned the words Tarot Club or described the other members. At most, she mentioned that the gloomiest was German Sparrow. Katlia thought and said, at your sequence, discussing knowledge at that level is indeed strange. However, if Adam were to delve deeper, he will realize that you're related to the Abraham family. It's quite normal to be aware of this information. What you need to pay attention to is that any major matters involving the Abraham family will require you to be wary of Adam. How do I be wary of him? Forced a helpless smile as she glanced at the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Then, she looked back at the hermit and said, "Thank you for your analysis." As Mr. Fool hadn't said anything, she decided to believe Hermit's words. At this moment, Klein sighed inwardly. Back when Catlin mentioned Adam during the tarot gathering, he wasn't aware that Adam's name wasn't to be verbalized, nor did he know that he was related to the Twilight Hermit Order. It was only when he entered Grozel's travels and learned from ascetic Snowman about Adam being the angel of imagination that he grasped this point and came up with the theory. After seeing Mr. Dawes' warning from Emperor Rozel's diary and gained preliminary confirmation, he ultimately lacked the opportunity to warn the various members. Furthermore, the way the Archbishop of the Church of Steam casually mentioned Adam's name made him believe that many people in the real world knew of Adam and that it wasn't taboo. Furthermore, Adam might not be his full name. He wasn't in a rush to guide the conversation towards this, but he was waiting for an opportunity. Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Any mention of it will be known? The organization established by Adam is really impressive. Is this the target our tarot club is aiming at? As Emlyn reflected over it poignantly, he gained a clear picture of the tarot club. He had previously been figuring out a category for the tarot club. He realized that it wasn't like an orthodox church, and it was unlike the other secret organizations. Apart from being a Messiah alliance, there wasn't anything too special. It muddled his analysis. And today, he finally confirmed that the early development of the Tarot Club could match Adam's organization. Knowing 0-08's trait, Leonard wasn't surprised that Adam had a similar trait. He was more concerned about the organization with many important figures participating, as well as the Abraham family, which Hermit had mentioned. He had once heard Pallas Zoroas mention this family's standing in the fourth epoch was very high. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 963. According to what Leonard knew, amongst the major noble families of the Fourth Epoch's Tudor Empire, the Abraham family was ranked first. It was even stronger than the Amorn family, who had the blasphemer. Of course, he couldn't be certain if the Amorn family didn't have any members, that it was all filled with the Son of God's avatars. Miss Magician is actually an important member of the Abraham family. Everyone here isn't to be trifled with. Is this what's called a gathering of protagonists? Leonard first sighed before he made a self-deprecating comment. Derek didn't say a word, nor did he make any connections. He seriously listened to Mr. World's description, as well as the conversation between the two ladies, the magician and the hermit, before keeping them to heart. To him, the other members were in the outside world. Regardless of what happened, it had little to do with him or the City of Silver. Only matters regarding the King of Angels was something to be concerned about. After all, be it the Angel of Fate Ouroboros, the Dark Angel Sasria, and Red Angel Medici, they had left traces around the City of Silver. As for the Angel of Time, Amorn, he had personally visited it before, bringing about inexplicable horror. After everyone quietened down, Derek couldn't help but consider certain matters. Any mention of it will be known. How should I inform the chief about such matters? Or is it fine not saying it for the time being? I'll just mention that Amorn is a son of the Creator, that he has another brother who's of the same pathway as the Dragon of Imagination. If the City of Silver were to encounter an overwhelming disaster, would Adam be able to hear it if I said his name? Can he enter the forsaken land of the gods? With this in mind, Derek instantly felt somewhat ashamed. This was because, in such situations, the honorific name he should chant was Mr. Fool's. At this moment, the world spoke again. Although War Angel Medici has long perished, he isn't completely dead. The soul he's left behind has fused with the souls of the ancestors of the two major families of Sauron and Einhorn, forming an evil spirit. During the death of Int Zangwill, there were traces of its appearance. Klein had specially brought up this point to firstly pass this information to the Church of Evernight via Leonard. Secondly, it was to remind the Hanged Man to take note. After all, he had been to Banzi twice, possibly embroiling himself with the Red Angel evil spirit's fate. That evil spirit was War Angel Medici? While Leonard was feeling alarmed, he was taken aback. He had just guessed that Adam wasn't the only bigwig who had been present. Later, setting off from the titles of War Angel and Angel of Imagination, he suspected that the evil spirit was a king of angels in its former life. And such an evil spirit had been sent to the underworld without putting up any resistance under the influence of the luck siphon charm. Old man's level is higher than I previously imagined. Yes, the evil spirit must have been weakened by Adam, and perhaps even by Mr. Fool, before Daly and I arrived. Otherwise, it's not an enemy we could have handled. Right, what was Adam doing back then? There wasn't any sign of him during the entire battle. Could it be that there was another figure at the level of a king of angels holding back Adam? Leonard felt tumultuous waves swishing through his heart as he forgot to observe the reactions of the other members. War Angel Medici. He perished and became an evil spirit. Banzi was the place his descendants lived. He was one of the founders of Rose Redemption. Alger quickly linked up the pieces of information and learned many new things. That mural I saw in the Banzi Harbour Telegraph office must have been drawn by that evil spirit. The World German Sparrow had gotten me to head to Banzi Harbour to search for traces in order to grasp that terrifying evil spirit's location. It was to prevent his subsequent plans from being disrupted. Thankfully, I didn't destroy that mural. Otherwise, I might have caught the notice of the evil spirit. While Alger sighed in relief, he felt increasingly alert. He planned on getting the Blue Avenger to leave Banzi Harbour and head for the northern front of the Sonia Sea to investigate the matter Mr. Fool had previously given him. Audrey, Cat Leah, and the other members listened attentively as they kept it in mind without making too many connections. This was because the matter the world was describing contained information that mostly consisted of key and rich points. And lacking the additional experiences and knowledge, they were unable to expand on the matter. After sharing the information that everyone needed to take note of, the world chuckled hoarsely. That's about it. After a brief silence, Emlyn straightened his back and looked ahead. An important figure from my kind will arrive in Backland, and a meeting with me has been arranged. After a pause, and seeing how no one responded, he cleared his throat and asked, "How should I deal with him?" Him. Another angel. Leonard felt numb as he noticed something. Mr. Moon had mentioned the concept of his kind, and he had red eyes. Leonard was taken aback as he thought to himself, "He's a sanguine?" Sanguine. Don't tell me he's Emlyn White from the Harvest Church. He had been close to Klein's identity as a detective. Leonard couldn't help but look at the Moon side profile and figure a few more times. The more Leonard looked at him, the more familiar he appeared. He was almost certain. Without any doubts, Emlyn noticed the Star sizing him up, just as Audrey was surprised and excited to confirm that Mr. Star had suddenly realized he knew Mr. Moon. Did I say something wrong? That fellow, the Star, looked somewhat astonished. He knows me in the real world? Do I know him? A series of thoughts flashed through Emlyn's mind as he subconsciously sniffed, trying to catch the scent of the new member beside him. However, the grey fog ensured that he failed. As he surveyed the area and waited for the Hanged Man, the Hermit, and the world to provide him with an analysis and suggestion, he tried hard to recall if he had met someone like the Star. Gradually, he felt a sense of familiarity, but he couldn't recall who it was due to the superficial impression the person left on him. At this point, Audrey recalled another problem. Mr. World and Mr. Star know each other, and Mr. Star knows Mr. Moon. Then, does Mr. World know Mr. Moon? She subconsciously sized up the person at the lower end of the long bronze table, but she failed to read anything of use from the World German Sparrow. As for Alger, he turned to look at the Moon after a few seconds of thought. He said with some deliberation, "Mr. Fool just mentioned that the times are changing." Although the important members of the Sanguine might not know of the ins and outs, at their level, they will more or less sense something and made preparations. The reason that this important figure wishes to meet you is both a probing action and surveillance. You just need to act as you usually do, but there will subsequently be some tests and missions. As I imagined. A second test and mission will begin. I wonder what revelation the ancestor has given. Emlyn nodded and said to the Hanged Man, "Thank you." With the question answered, Force, who had been holding back all this while, finally spoke. Mr. Moon, the intelligence you gave me regarding the abandoned ancient castle was highly problematic. There were 2 ancient wraiths, but in the underground area was a door. Sealed behind the door is a powerful corruptive power. As long as one enters the region where the ancient wraiths are, they will be corrupted. This? Emlyn frowned slightly. He wasn't enraged, and he instead felt that her description was completely right. If the person who had provided the intelligence knew that there were 2 ancient wraiths, he wouldn't have ignored that door. As a cultured and noble sanguine, Emlyn never wished for anyone to incur any losses or harm because of his mistakes or neglect. He was rather perturbed by this as he thought and solemnly said, I will investigate the source and provide you with an answer. As Force had returned safely, she didn't mind it too much. She tersely answered, indicating that she was awaiting the outcome. Explore new novels on novelbin.com. As for being saved by Mr. Fool, with it happening once a month or even twice a month, she had already lost count. She was prepared to do anything Mr. Fool instructed her to do in the future. After they finished their conversation, Audrey was somewhat concerned. She asked out of curiosity, do you know what brought about that corruptive force? Force shook her head. I don't know. With Mr. Fool not sharing any information, and how she didn't have any Roselle diary entries to exchange for the answer to the card of blasphemy, Audrey retracted her gaze and attentively listened to the conversation of the other members. After a while, the learning segment came to an end as the Tarot Club drew to a close. The members stood up and bowed at the existence at the end of the long bronze table to bid him farewell. This time, Leonard didn't appear too slow. The dark red light dissipated as he returned to the real world. In front of him was a red glove he hadn't worn. At this moment, a slightly aged voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Whose dream did you enter a moment ago? Old man has woken up. Leonard was first delighted before he heaved a sigh of relief. He didn't immediately answer Palace Zoroast as he deliberated over an answer. Say, it is possible that, at certain times, Dwayne Dantes is Isaac Eggers who's disguised using some particular item. After learning that Dwayne Dantes was a shared identity, he began doubting Old Man's original theory. This was because this parasite had came to a conclusion based on the different appearances and auras of Isaac Eggers and Dwayne Dantes. Furthermore, not every one of Mr. Fool's blessed looked identical to Dwayne Dantes, nor were every one of them beyond us of the seer pathway. Therefore, since a shared identity was needed, it meant that they wielded a mystical item or sealed artifact that allowed them to transform into someone else. Together with the ancient aura of being a blessed causing some interference, it wasn't impossible for an angel to make an error in judgment. Palace Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, You reminded me. Isaac Eggers does have a mask that allows him to transform into anyone. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 964. As expected. After confirming his hypothesis, Leonard didn't harp on the matter as he returned to the topic at hand. Old man, didn't you ask whose dream I entered? Yes, on the day we sought revenge against Ince Zangwell, Amorn's brother and a king of angels appeared. In his mind, the slightly aged voice didn't immediately reply. After a few seconds, there was a sigh. It's just as I expected. Matters related to 0-08 will often attract Adam. Thankfully, I chose to sleep ahead of time. Leonard didn't have the time to ponder over Palace Zoroast's words as he instinctively cried out, Old man, why you said his name? Adam's gaze was about to be cast over, or might have already landed on them. The slightly aged voice chuckled. You actually know about Adam's trait. However, me mentioning him doesn't matter. He will only imagine that someone else is talking about him. Of course, there's no need for you to know too much. That will definitely make you occasionally think of it. Once that happens too frequently or at a close physical distance, Adam will also know of it, just like 0-08. Furthermore, 0-08's influence is limited to a huge city, while Adam's is the entire world. As horrifying as Amorn. Another form of horror? Leonard composed himself and forced himself to stop thinking about Adam as he ruminated over what Pallas Zoroast had said. Suddenly, he nearly blurted out without suppressing his voice. "Old man, did you sleep not because you were weak, but because you were afraid of encountering Amorn's brother?" "A whom?" Pallas cleared his throat. "It was a result of both reasons, but they don't contradict one another. After giving you the 2 worms of time, my condition deteriorated again. Under such circumstances, how am I to deal with a king of angels and conceal my existence? I'm already old and feeble. There's no need for such developments, so it's almost necessary for me to hide." Leonard was momentarily at a loss for words and said after a few seconds, "Amorn and our brother should be older than you. The ancient sun god is an ancient god before the cataclysm." Without waiting for Pallas Zoroast's reply, he heaved a sigh of relief. "That is to say that, because of your act of sealing yourself and sleeping, that king of angels didn't discover a problem with me." Pallas chuckled. "No, it was discovered." Leonard's expression sank as he nearly looked around frantically. He suspected that Adam was sitting in some corner, silently listening to his conversation with Old Man. At this moment, Pallas Zoroast added, "You were very close to him. Do you think you can hide from a king of angels who has accommodated the spectator pathway's uniqueness? Besides, you likely cried out Old Man impolitely at the most critical moment." Leonard was taken aback as he subconsciously answered, "Why, you heard it." He suspected that Old Man had heard him but had deliberately chosen to ignore him for fear of being discovered by Adam. "No." Pallas' slightly aged voice teased, "I don't have to hear it to know what you would do. How can I not be aware of what kind of person you are?" Amidst Leonard's embarrassment, Pallas Zoroast continued, "Adam definitely knows that you've been parasitized, but as I'd sealed myself and was asleep, he didn't discover who was parasitizing you. The demigods with such abilities aren't many, but it's also not a very tiny number." "Is that so?" Leonard instantly heaved a sigh of relief. He was most worried about having Adam see Old Man before returning to inform blasphemer Amorn. With this in mind, Leonard raised a question he had been wondering all this while. "Old Man, what's a king of angels?" Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Pallas Zoroast didn't ask where Leonard had learned of this concept, as he simply explained, "Those that exceed sequence 1 but have yet to become a deity. If we are specifically talking about the 8 kings of angels, apart from those that meet the previous definition, they're the ones who served the ancient sun god before the cataclysm. What does it mean to exceed sequence 1 but have yet to become a deity? How is that achieved? By accommodating the so-called uniqueness?" Leonard had the intention of asking, but he suspected that Old Man wouldn't answer in detail. He gradually decided to first talk about other matters before finding an opportunity to raise this issue again. He deliberated for a moment and said with a suppressed voice, "During the battle for Event within Zangwell, I faced immense adversity, to the point of not being able to look at my enemy head-on, much less use the luck siphon charm. When seeking your help failed, I chose to chant Mr. Fool's honorific name and had received a response. After everything ended, I found myself heading for an ancient palace as though I was dreaming. It was above the boundless grey fog." Before Leonard finished his description, Pallas, who had been listening quietly, cut him off. "You met the Fool?" "Yes, his aura is vastly deeper than the sea, loftier than the mountains. His figure was cloaked in the grey fog, preventing anyone from seeing it clearly." Leonard recalled his encounter and described in a poetic manner. "He established an organization, holding a Divine Council, a true one, every Monday afternoon. I'm already one of the members." Pallas fell silent once again and didn't say a word for quite some time. Only after a while did he say, "The Fool allowed you to tell me this?" "Yes." Sitting there, Leonard nodded and let out a suppressed voice into the air as he said, "Old Man, do you know him?" Pallas Zoroast sighed and said, "No, but I can roughly guess of his origins." "You don't have to ask what it is because I won't tell you. This might be an opportunity for you. Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to become a demigod." Leonard turned again before closing his mouth. He stopped mentioning the tarot gathering because Mr. Fool hadn't given him permission to go into the details of other matters. He thought and said, "Old man, is there another king of angels named Medici, known as the War Angel?" Pallas tersely acknowledged. "You can also address him as Red Angel. However, he has long perished. You were even close to where he died." "Where?" Leonard was surprised, but he had no impression of that happening. Pallas scoffed. "Are the memories of you people from the Evernight pathway so terrible? I recall that your goddess wasn't like that. Do you still remember the ruin found beneath Backland? The Tudor Trunsoist United Empire? The place where Alistair Tudor became Blood Emperor?" Leonard asked in enlightenment. Pallas' Zoroast's slightly aged voice resounded once again. "That's right." As Leonard tried to figure out the logic embedded in this matter, he informed Old Man of the evil spirit. The remnant soul of Medici fused with the two angels of the Sauron and Einhorn family, becoming a brand new evil spirit? Pallas repeated Leonard's words in disbelief. Following that, he couldn't hide his amusement and said, "The three of them are absolute archenemies, the kind that can't stand each other's existence. To think that they are together in death, fused as one, is truly, ha ha, it must be quite lively." Leonard didn't know what Old Man was laughing about as he subconsciously asked, "These are archenemies?" Pallas held back his laughter as he said, "Yes, the reason why Medici failed and was captured was because he was dealing with the Sauron ancestor who had fallen into his trap. It wasn't that he wasn't prepared, but that was mainly focused on the primordial demonist side." Surprisingly, Alistair Tudor suddenly went mad. On this matter, Amorn and Adam had played a rather important role. That evil spirit is an enemy of Adam. Why would the Blood Emperor want to capture Medici and the two angels of Sauron and Einhorn? The place they perished was in the palace where Alistair Tudor was trying to become Blood Emperor. They were the ritual materials needed to become a true god. According to Mr. Fool, Adam is one step closer to divinity after obtaining 0-08. Is this also considered a gathering of materials? Amorn is dealing with Old Man because of similar reasons? Leonard had some theories and had the urge to ask, but he ultimately held back. He was afraid that he touched on highly secretive matters, causing Old Man to react negatively. He planned on finding an opportunity at the Tarot Club to ask about such matters. After a brief silence, Leonard looked at the closed door and said with a suppressed voice, "Has Mr. Fool and the church reached a certain degree of tacit cooperation?" "That's the implication if no one is investigating you," Pallas Zoroast answered in a rather direct manner. Leonard nodded indiscernibly. "What will they arrange me to do next?" "Arrangement? Reward you for the services rendered and allow you to advance to Sequence 5 after you finish digesting the potion. Then, you will be allocated a Red Gloves team and you'll be sent to complete missions. Otherwise, they might send you to a large diocese like Backland to be a deacon in charge of certain matters," Pallas said without much concern. "Back to Backland. Klein seems to be planning something in Backland." Leonard's thoughts were suddenly liberated. He didn't converse with Old Man again as he slumped against the wall and cradled his head with his hands, sitting rather leisurely. Late at night, in the border town of East and West Balam, outside a row of warehouses. Dressed in a formal suit, Dwayne Dantes, with his white sideburns, was holding a gold-inlaid cane. After exchanging signals and countersigns with the officer on duty, he watched as the officer opened the door to the warehouse and heard him say in a relaxed manner, "It's everything inside. Check the goods and move it yourself. Also, pay me the remaining amount before leaving." Dwayne Dantes nodded slightly and weighed the suitcase in hand. In it was £5,000 in cash entirely from May Sanchez's down payment. At this moment, two figures were silently watching this develop 2 warehouses away in a 3-story building. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 965. On the top floor of a small building, a black-haired, brown-eyed man donning dark-colored clothes was looking down at the arms deal not far away. This man, who looked about 28, couldn't help but say, "He actually got May Sanchez? Oh, holy Lord of Storms, Alfred, if I had known it would turn out this way, we might as well have done the mission ourselves. Even if all the expenses are deducted, we should still earn at least £20,000. The man beside him was a young man in a black trench coat. He looked about 24 and had a head of resplendent blonde hair and blue eyes that resembled a lake. He had pretty good looks. Being addressed as Alfred, he shook his head and said, "No, that would be too noticeable. May Sanchez's allegiance has always been unclear." Before figuring out his take on matters, rashly discussing an arms deal with him is extremely dangerous. Dwayne Dantes is able to earn £20,000 because he dares to take the risk. The black-haired and brown-eyed man immediately scoffed. To think that Alfred Hall, who has led a few dozen men to assault a battalion with over 1,000 troops, would claim that he doesn't dare take risks. Alfred shot a glance at him and said, "Pagani, this isn't the same thing. That happened because I was confident of wiping out their command center. And once there's a lack of leadership, 1,000 scattered troops might not be as formidable as 1,000 pigs. In addition, the transaction this time is solely a test. It's to establish communications and to set up a channel. If it's done by us, who are we to seek out the next time? And the subsequent ones? If we keep at it, we will ultimately expose ourselves. Once that happens, it will be a diplomatic matter. Furthermore, with the deals deepening and broadening, who knows if this would incur the notice of the demigods of other factions? That would spell danger." "Ha ha," Pagani said with a smile. "How can demigods be that free to pay notice to such small-scale arm deals? Every faction has a limited number of demigods. There are too many matters awaiting them." "I know. I'm only raising an example," Alfred replied in a staid manner. Pagani didn't harp on the matter and turned his gaze back to Dwayne Dantes, who stood outside the warehouse. "This gentleman is said to be very generous. He donated stocks worth more than £10,000 to the Church of Evernight shortly after he arrived in Backland. Is this the early-stage investments that you often speak of? Also, he seems to be working at the same charity foundation with your sister. TSK, such men are very welcome with the young ladies. He's good-looking and has an outstanding demeanor. He's smart, experienced, and has the artifice. He has seen all kinds of women, and he's at the age to settle down. Alfred, you have to warn Audrey that a playboy will always be one and that one's moral character is a flaw that can never be corrected. You can't let the most dazzling jewel of Backland be taken by this fellow." Alfred turned his head to glare at Pagani. "There's no need for you to show any concern about such matters. Audrey isn't a young and clueless lady. Her knowledge of the world is far more mature than you imagine. Besides, my father and mother are in Backland. They have the ability to prevent any nasty things from happening." Upon saying that, Alfred looked at the nearby arms warehouse and paused. "May Sanchez actually sent Haggis. I'll go greet him. This isn't the best time to meet, right?" Just as Pagani was about to say a word, Alfred had already turned to walk down the stairs. Klein, in the form of Dwayne Dantes, didn't bring any servants. He held his gold-inlaid cane and stood with May Sanchez's representative, Haggis, outside the warehouse. They watched as crates of munitions were carried out and loaded onto carriages. At this moment, he half-turned his body upon sensing something and looked elsewhere. The person that was reflected in his eyes was a young man wearing a trench coat without a hat. His blonde hair was combed into a slick back, and his blue eyes looked like a lake under a bright clear sky. He was tall with a good build. His every move exuded an indescribable sense of dignity. Even without any troops surrounding him, the authority he wielded was obvious. "Alfred!" Haggis noticed the man as well when he cried out in delighted surprise. "Alfred! Miss Justice's second elder brother?" This feeling resembles that of the arbiter pathway. Klein raised his right hand and took off his top hat to press it against his chest as a form of greeting. After Alfred Hall greeted Haggis, he turned to look at Dwayne Dantes. "Your character is widely spread across Backland. Even I've heard of you, despite being in East Balam." "Character? A character at making arms deals?" Klein lampooned as he chuckled. "I'm only doing things that I believe need to be done." Alfred nodded. "I believe there's no need for any self-introductions. Haggis should have mentioned me to you." "Yes, Colonel Hall," Klein replied with a smile. I only learned that Miss Audrey has another brother here in the southern continent after I arrived, that he served in the military and has rendered impressive services. Alfred cast his gaze on Dwayne Dantes' face and changed the topic. I thought you would take the opportunity to work at the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation, but you surprised me by choosing to come to the southern continent. Klein maintained his smile from before. For an outsider to truly enter a pre-existing circle is quite impossible just by giving donations, doing charity, and hosting balls and banquets. Alfred tersely answered, very wise. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he asked Haggis, did something happen in Kokawa? It seemed rather serious. Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Haggis squeezed a smile. I'm not too sure. I was hiding in an underground bunker at the general's residence. I later heard that there was a lightning storm at Revival Square. Lightning storm? Alfred's gaze turned towards Dwayne Dantes again. Klein nodded and said, indeed. The hotel I was staying at isn't too far from Revival Square. I did see continuous bolts of lightning striking that area. All of that happened in the day. Alfred's gaze turned towards Haggis again. What happened to the scene in the end? Most of the area was in shambles. There were marks of lightning strikes. Haggis didn't hide the truth at all. Alfred nodded gently and pointed to the side before saying to Haggis and Dwayne Dantes, I still have other matters to tend to. We can chat again when the opportunity arises. See you again, Klein politely replied. It made them appear to be at a social gathering instead of being outside a munitions warehouse. He was watching Alfred Hall leave when his body trembled. His head made an abrupt turn to the side. In the primitive forests that covered East and West Balam, a figure was slowly outlined with his back bent. He had a fleshy face with slightly brown skin. His clothes were baggy, and he had a rapier by his waist. In his hand was a silver mask. Looking to his sides, this figure straightened his body. He was none other than Admiral Hell Ludwell, who had previously entered the underworld. However, at this moment, 2 clumps of blood-red flames were burning in his eye sockets. He looked completely different from before. I'm starving. Ludwell opened his mouth, letting out a sigh that seemed to come from his chest. He then cast his gaze in a different direction, muttering, the owner of this marionette is over there. Fate has brought us together again. He has a hunter pathway item on him. It's perfect for replenishing myself. Just as he said that, a bloody mouth appeared on the left cheek of Ludwell's face. It opened and closed as it said, Medici, what we need to deal with first is our survival. After this marionette loses its connection to its owner, it's no different from the dead. The remnant spirit will quickly return to the underworld and not be able to maintain the body. And without the underworld inside him, we will inevitably be weakened until we dissipate. Yes, the most pressing matter now is to find another gatekeeper. Another mouth appeared on Ludwell's right cheek. Red Angel Medici immediately scoffed. Sauron, Feinhorn, were the 2 of you women in the past? Your nature as angels has been left in the dumps because of you. That fellow was able to resist 0-08's arrangement several times, implying that he's definitely not simple. With a chance to lock onto him, how can we give it up? Once this marionette completely dies, things wouldn't be that simple again. Besides, the hunter pathway item on him can effectively extend our existence. Once we finish him, it wouldn't be too late finding a gatekeeper. The bloody crack on Ludwell's left cheek immediately scoffed. Medici, have you sacrificed your brain to the true creator? That fellow has clearly advanced. In our current condition, defeating a bizarro sorcerer isn't difficult, but killing him is nearly impossible. Medici wasn't frustrated, and instead, he laughed deeply. This isn't something unresolvable. As long as you allow me to chant my lord's honorific name, helpers will immediately arrive. A gatekeeper might even be automatically brought here. The mouth on Ludwell's right cheek immediately opened and closed. Sauron, let's work together to stop him and search for a gatekeeper. All right. The mouth on Ludwell's left cheek didn't hesitate to reply. Upon seeing this, Red Angel Medici laughed. The two of you have fallen for it. My goal has been met. I can confirm that the two of you were previously women. The two mouths on Ludwell's cheeks roared, "Shut up. Humph, we've been merged together for 2,000 years. Would we not know what tricks you're up to? There's no need to struggle again." As they spoke, the colors around Admiral Hell Ludwell instantly saturated and stacked upon one another. He had entered the spirit world and began traversing it. Outside the munitions warehouse, Klein finally retracted his gaze as his premonition for danger vanished. For that one moment, he had a baffling feeling, but he was unable to project the corresponding scene in his mind. What happened? Klein muttered to himself. Without waiting any further, he threw the suitcase in his hand to the officer who was in charge of handing and taking over. Then, he said to Haggis, "The rest is yours. You can give me the rest of the payment." He was referring to the heavy case filled with gold bars and coins. Haggis had planned on having drinks with Dwayne Dantes after the completion of the deal to celebrate its success and to discuss any future deals. He never expected Dwayne Dantes to be in such a hurry to leave. "All right. It's on the carriage," he pointed and said. Alfred, who had already walked quite a distance, turned his head to look over, perplexed. He wasn't sure why Dwayne Dantes wasn't following the pre-designated procedure. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 966. Seeing Alfred look over, Klein returned with a smile and nodded gently. "I suddenly sensed some danger." With that said, he calmly turned around and headed for the carriage which Haggis had pointed out. Danger. Alfred repeated the word softly as he warily surveyed his surroundings but failed to find anything odd. He slowed down his pace, constantly taking note of his surroundings before returning to the nearby three-story building with out-of-the-ordinary vigilance. Pagani glanced at the heavy expression wearing Alfred and asked, feeling somewhat puzzled, what happened? He was quite a distance from the arms deal, so he hadn't heard their conversation. Alfred walked to the window and looked down at the convoy that was prepared to leave after loading the munitions. He deliberated and said, "Dwayne Dantes suddenly left, saying that he had sensed danger." Danger? Pagani didn't dismiss it as he warily looked around. He didn't notice anything amiss even when May Sanchez's men left the region and vanished into the darkness. He then laughed. "Ha ha, Alfred, I think you're too sensitive. I believe it's solely because Dwayne Dantes is a coward and was unwilling to stay here for too long." Alfred retracted his gaze and frowned. Perhaps. After returning to his hotel, Klein made Enzo, who had turned into a mixed-blood lad, open the suitcase in his hand. He took out the gold coins and bars one by one and did the count. It was valued at a total of 30,000 Lun gold pounds. Thankfully, my previous agreement with Miss Messenger is 10,000 Lun gold coins. I don't need to make any additional conversions. Sitting leisurely in the reclining chair, Klein drank the sweet and sour but refreshing Guedar as he monitored his marionette's work. After Enzo separated the items, he took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with the four blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. It was as though she was constantly nearby. Her 8 eyes turned towards the pile of gold coins and gold bars that had been separated. After a few seconds, the 4 heads in Rionette Tinker's hand said, "Very good. In the future, missions will cost more. What's the logic behind this? Why are you raising the price after the mission despite me paying you so quickly?" Klein was taken aback as he asked with a straightened back, "What?" Rionette Tinker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads nodded seriously. "Mission price depends on your ability to earn money. I never expected that." Klein turned agape, but he was unable to retort. After all, such matters were solely decided by the helper. Furthermore, with him advancing to sequence 4 and becoming a demigod, the missions that he needed her help with in the future was likely to increase in difficulty and danger. It was seemingly reasonable to increase the price. After Rionette Tinker swallowed the gold coins and vanished from the room, Klein reined in his thoughts and began doing calculations regarding his current wealth. My expenses have been quite significant recently. I'm left with £17,275 in cash and 65 gold coins. This pile of gold bars is worth £25,000. That makes for a total of more than £40,000. It's not something to dismiss in all of the Lun Kingdom. I can already buy a manor and some land for farming. Arms dealing sure is profitable. Rionette Tinker needed gold coins, so whatever was left were gold bars. Standing up and sending the gold bars above the grey fog, Klein walked to the window and cast his gaze to the north. With the matter coming to a close, he was poised to return to Backland. Looking at the horizon, Klein suddenly sighed silently. Backland. North Borough, Backland University of Technology. Audrey was touring the campus with a few staff members of the Lun Charity Bursary Foundation. New chapters will be fully updated at n.el/bin.com. She was dressed in a simple, light green dress. By her waist was a white, unadorned leather belt. Her blonde hair had a veiled hat with ribbon flowers that showed off her playful side. She didn't wear any other accessories other than a silver bangle on her left wrist. She looked no different from a female student that came from a family that could only be considered middle class. Over the past few days, she had been to public primary schools that bordered East Borough, and she had visited the technical schools in the area around Backland Bridge. She already knew the appropriate clothes needed for the occasion, not treating charity work as another social scene. Her green, limpid eyes darted around slightly as she wore a faint smile as she observed the students that came and went. Backland University of Technology had recently sent out its acceptance letters, and it was matriculation day for the new class of students. Matriculation should have happened in late August or early September, but as a newly restructured university, Backland University of Technology's entrance examinations were later than the other universities. That also delayed the results, which also meant that students that applied to the school had also participated in the examinations of other universities or might have already been accepted. Therefore, they had brought forward the registration work to confirm the matriculated numbers before deciding how many more students needed to be accepted. Due to this, Audrey and the Lun Charity Bursary Foundation staff came to help the first batch of approved applicants to complete their matriculation procedure. Wherever she could see, she discovered that the students on campus wore a beaming expression, and every action they made exuded obvious confidence. Their words and actions had an indescribable vigor, one that seemed to have immense hope for the future that allowed them to see light. And this feeling was completely different from the few public primary schools that Audrey had experienced in the past. The students there were either boorish and noisy or silent and gloomy. A common trait of theirs was being uneasy and confused. Whenever they encountered strangers of status, they would be filled with trepidation. Their eyes were dull, lacking the spirit that youths ought to have. I really wish those kids will have a chance of receiving higher education and be like the students here, where they can work hard for a better future. As Audrey sighed silently, she swept her gaze to a male-female duo who were likely siblings. The elder brother had clearly stepped into society and started working. He wore a silk hat and wore a rather thin black formal suit. He appeared to be in his 30s and had the air resembling a civil servant. He had borrowed a rather old camera from somewhere and had placed it on a tripod. He gestured for his younger sister to move and adjust her pose as he searched for the best angle. The sister was about 17 or 18, and her black hair simply cascaded down. Her brown eyes had a look of exasperation, but she didn't say a word as she seriously listened to her brother's instructions. Such combinations were everywhere on campus. Some of them had parents and their child, while others were groups of friends. What a beautiful scene! Audrey looked away and continued proceeding forward. It was a square, and in the middle of it was a decommissioned steam locomotive. Its massive body was standing there proudly, adding industrial vibes to the Backland University of Technology. Whoosh! The behemoth-like steam locomotive spewed out smoke as it hauled its long body into the platform before slowing down a stop. A mixed-blood, 7- or 8-year-old girl who looked like a doll held her mother's hand as she waited in a long line. She asked her father, who was similarly mixed blood with Lun and Balaam heritage, about Desi Bay. Amidst her shuffling, she saw a gentleman with white sideburns and a top hat holding a gold-inlaid cane. He had a servant with brown skin as he walked towards first class. The servant looked around curiously and said, "Sir, the recent situation is different from what I had imagined. I thought the people from Balaam would lead tough and difficult lives, with squalid, chaotic, poor, and repressed surroundings. But there was none of them. We even drank Gueda and smoked East Balaam cigarettes. There were even some people who could afford bikes. As you know, although I have Balaam blood in me, I was born in Backland. I've never been to the southern continent. Of course, my Deutonese is still not too bad." The very noble middle-aged gentleman chuckled and waved his cane. "That's because we only went to the cities and regions that aren't too bad. The saddest people of Balaam are in the villages, in the plantations. The rest take up residence around the factories, creating slums. We never had a chance to see them." As though sensing the girl's notice, the gentleman with his deep blue eyes and his servant looked over and gave a warm smile. The corners of their lips clearly curled up, revealing 8 teeth before they nodded gently, looked away, and continued on their way. Before long, the girl and her parents boarded the steam locomotive and found their seats. When the whistle sounded again, the girl saw a man with dark brown skin, soft facial features, and red lumps on his cheek walk over with his head bowed. His hand pressed on his hat as he quickly walked down the aisle and headed for the head of the train. The man knocked on the partition before quickly entering the operator's compartment and said to the train driver, "All the train attendants have been swapped with our men. The bridge ahead is where the sacrifice will be held." With a thick mustache, the train driver nodded and said, "May God be satisfied with the sacrificial items on this train. Let's hope we can gain eternal life in the kingdom." Whoosh! The steam locomotive drove under a bridge before cruising past a huge bridge. After a long trip, it finally arrived at its destination, the pier. The doll-like, mixed-blood girl was somewhat sleepy and was no longer as lively as before. Under her parents' lead, she followed the crowd and inched towards the door. There were a few attendants at the door who were helping some of the passengers remove their luggage. When the girl and her parents walked past, these attendants curled the corners of their lips and revealed 8 teeth, showcasing a warm smile. After the girl jumped onto the platform, she looked back at them subconsciously. She saw figures standing outside the door, discussing something. Among them was the train conductor, as well as the man with the lumps on his cheek. A second later, these people turned their heads over and curled the corners of their lips, revealing 8 teeth. The girl retracted her gaze and skipped along as she left the platform with her parents. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 967. Cold winds blew across the platform at night, causing the hanging gas lamps to sway. The light of dusk stretched and shortened from time to time in this scene, allowing the steam locomotive that was silently parked on the tracks to oscillate between being cloaked in shadows or escaping the darkness. It had an indescribable sense of gloom and death. At this moment, a squad of black and white checkered policemen entered the platform. Under the lead of the railway company's duty manager, they walked to the huge train that appeared old. For some reason, after the passengers disembarked, all the train staff, including the train driver, returned to the carriage and never came out again. I sent people to look for them and get them out to have some rest, but they quickly ran out looking like that had been inflicted with a disease. All they could do was hysterically shout, "They're all dead, they're all dead." The railway duty manager in a blue coat held a lamp, walking as he briefed the police about the situation. From his stammering and trembling body, the police could easily tell the extreme horror in him. It was as though a sudden tap on his shoulder would literally cause him to jump and abandon everything to rush for the exit. His emotions infected the police. All of them held their hands to their waists as they pressed onto their holsters. Tap! 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 The leather shoes hitting the solid, hard ground left reverberating echoes. The police followed the duty manager and warily entered the front carriage. Inside the carriage, there were 2 people sitting in each row. They were distributed to the left and right, and they stood away from the windows. At that moment, they were leaning against the backs of their seats, motionless. Through the illumination of the gas lamps outside and lanterns in their hands, the inspectors leading them very quickly recognized the scene before him. Here were the staff of the steam locomotive. They were wearing blue uniforms that differed for men and women, and they were sitting in different seats in silence. Their faces were pale and their eyes wide open. Although there wasn't any sounds of breathing, the corners of their lips were curved up, revealing 8 teeth. Everyone present felt their hair stand up upon seeing the uniform smiles as they subconsciously held their breaths. This was an extremely bizarre and terrifying scene. All they wished was to turn around and leave, beginning investigations only when it was bright. The leading inspector drew 2 deep gasps before he instructed the constables beside him. "Go confirm if they are dead." Upon saying that, he glanced at the duty manager. "Follow him and see if there's anyone missing or excess people included." "All right, officer," the duty manager said with a trembling voice. As he and the constables ventured deeper into the carriage, the other policemen drew their revolvers and remained on high alert. In an unbearable silence, time slowly ticked by until, finally, one of the constables stopped at the end of the carriage, turned around, and shouted, "It's confirmed. All of them are dead." The railway manager stuttered immediately after him, "There are 2 missing. The train driver and the train conductor." The inspector calmed down significantly when he realized that nothing had happened all this time. He thought and said to all the constables, "Maintain the corpse's present state and await an autopsy." Meanwhile, split into 2 teams. One team is to head to the other carriages to search for the train conductor and driver, while the other team is to check the scene for clues and relevant information. Once the sun rises, we will begin investigations starting with the train personnel and the passengers who were previously on board. We will search for any commonalities and peculiarities. Although many passengers didn't present their identification documents when purchasing tickets, the inspector believed that it was possible to find people who had registered themselves and learn from them of any abnormalities on the train or passengers worth paying attention to. Just as he said that, a biting cold wind stirred, blowing through the carriage. When all of this came to an end, the inspector was about to emphasize his orders when he suddenly noticed something amiss. The steam locomotive staff members who were in their seats still had their eyes open with their whites showing and their faces pale. However, their mouths had closed at some point in time and were no longer showing their 8 teeth. Inside a luxurious hotel room, the wall lamps shone brightly onto the carpeted region where a desk stood. Klein had transformed into German Sparrow and was sitting on a single-seater. He had his left leg crossed over his right. Beside him was Enzo, who looked like a native. In front of him stood a row of cultist marionettes. They were the people involved in attempting to make a sacrifice on the steam locomotive: the man with the lumpy cheek, the train conductor, and the train driver. They had circled from different streets, donning different looks to gather here. "Who made you do the sacrifice?" Klein asked in a deep voice. After advancing to sequence 4 and becoming a bizarro sorcerer, not only was he able to read the thoughts of his marionette's superficial consciousness, he could also use the increased control of spirit body threads to do things similar to spirit channeling. Of course, the higher the level of the marionette, the poorer the effects of the spirit channeling. After a brief silence, the conductor, who was clearly Lun with rather thick body hair, said blankly, "It's a revelation from God." "Which God?" Klein received the porcelain teacup from Enzo and took a sip. The train conductor replied in a daze, "God is God. There are no others." Klein lowered his cup and asked, "How did he reveal his revelation? What was said exactly?" The conductor instantly turned reverent. "He gave a revelation through a divine item, requesting us to sacrifice many lives to pleasure him. In return, he will give us eternal life in his kingdom." Sacrifice many lives. Compared to the numinous episcopate, the Rose school of thought prefers doing such things. They have always been infamous for blood sacrifices. But to have eternal life in God's kingdom is closer to the numinous episcopate's beliefs. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that it was fabricated. Klein pondered for a moment and asked, "What divine item?" The train driver didn't reply as he glanced at the man with the red, lumpy cheek. The man then took out an item from an inner pocket. It was a cloth doll of shabby craftsmanship with curved eyes and mouth. God will issue us commands at a specific time through it. I bought it at a flea market, the man with the lumpy cheek said slowly without any perturbation in his tone. This? Klein instantly thought of many possibilities before getting Enzo to take the cloth doll and scrutinize it carefully, but he didn't discover anything odd. With his experience, this meant that the problem wasn't with the doll. That meant that there were two possibilities. First, someone was using the doll as a decoy while acting as a deity nearby. Second, it was a truly secret existence who had specially labeled the item to send a revelation. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. If it's the former, the train attendant's death would have been discovered, and preparations would have been made. If it's the latter, perhaps nothing has been detected. Klein contemplated for a moment and made Enzo place the cloth door on the desk in front of the window. He then stood up and instantly transformed into another train attendant and stood with the row of cultists. Similar changes happened when Enzo returned. After an unknown period of time, the night grew deeper. Suddenly, on the desk bathed in crimson moonlight, the cloth doll with curved eyes and mouth moved its limbs and slowly stood up. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 968. The cloth doll turned its lifeless eyes before its body stood up straight. It looked towards the area that the crimson moonlight failed to illuminate. There, the man with the lumpy cheek and the other cultists had been standing quietly, but at this moment, they bowed their heads, raising their arms as though they were praying, piously listening to the revelation. About 2 to 3 seconds later, the cloth doll finally stood up straight. Just as it was about to open its tongueless mouth and produce a voice that didn't belong to the body it was in, all its movements suddenly turned sluggish, as though it was a highly rusted robot. Hidden amongst the cultists, Klein had seen a strange spirituality thread extend from the cloth doll. Without any hesitation, he began controlling it. Inside the wall lamp-illuminated room, the lights dimmed instantly. The doll with curved eyes and mouth instantly lost the support that seemed to arise from having a skeleton before slumping to the table, motionless. Amidst the flickering street lights that were more than 1,000 meters away, Klein lost control over the blob of spirit body threads. The power that descended with the help of the doll took less than 2 seconds to escape out of his range. Whoosh! A biting cold wind swept up inside the room as the rug with tables and chairs above was suddenly tugged, sending the man with the lumpy cheek and most of the other cultists tumbling. Only the disguised Klein had jumped up in time to avoid the accident. Of course, winner Enzo stood perfectly fine at the border of the rug, completely unaffected. Whoosh! Amidst the cold wind, the rug rolled up and bound the few cultists and covered their noses and mouth tightly, gripping their throats. Meanwhile, the fountain pens on the table had their caps removed autonomously before shooting forward, stabbing into the neck of the man with the lumpy cheek. They left no gaps in the dense array of pens. A wooden chair exploded as its splinters swept over without sparing any of the remaining cultists. Near the wall, the pipe of a wall lamp cracked, causing the gas inside to whistle out. The cloth that draped the sofa rose up, tied itself into a robe, and wrapped around the train conductor's throat. A few of the floor tiles flew up, stabbing a few cultists from below. Instantly, all the items in the room were filled with offensive capability as though they were attempting to kill all signs of life inside. Klein tried to dodge, but his shirt, pants, belt, coat, and hat seemed to have a life of their own. They forcefully locked him down on the spot. He hurriedly opened his mouth and let out a sound, "Pa." He had mimicked the sound of snapping fingers. Scarlet flame surged out from his clothes, instantly blanketing his body and removing the restraints. At this moment, the cloth on another sofa rose up as though it was draped over someone. This strange scene reflected in Klein's eyes immediately as he trembled and turned stiff. He had been possessed by an evil spirit. The flames that soared up from before hadn't extinguished. They were burning away his clothes and flesh, only to reduce him to a pitch-black paper figurine. Behind this paper figurine was a pattern covered with feathers. It was a surreal and illusory feeling. This was the mutated paper figurine that had been tainted with artificial death's aura. Klein knew that there were only 2 situations that were possible for the doll to mutate. One was that the entity disguising as a god was nearby and had sensed the deaths of the cultists, hence, preparations were made via a deliberate descent, laying a trap for the antagonist. Another was that the one using the doll was indeed some secret existence. He wasn't aware that the sacrificial ritual had been foiled and descended at the predetermined time to give the next round of revelations. And regardless of which situation it was, it meant danger. Therefore, how could Klein perform unprepared? Based on the characteristics of a descent or the possession of the doll, he had already placed the paper figurine, which had mutated because of the corruption of artificial death's aura, in the iron cigar case. He had also maintained the level of his marionette at the level of an ordinary person in order to lure the target into possessing him. At this point, the possession target of the god that the cultists worshipped had gone from Klein to the death paper figurine. As the scarlet flame swept about, the pitch-black paper figurine ignited as a pale white color spread abruptly, tinged with a slightly dark green color. A rather painful grunt sounded as a transparent after-image flashed across a window tinted with the crimson moonlight. Almost at the same instant, the items that came alive inside the room fell to the ground, returning to their lifeless state. As for Enzo, flames were swirling around him. At this moment, in the port city north of the southern continent, the residents were enjoying the comfort and warmth of their home and family at night. They didn't notice that their glass windows and the surfaces of the wall lamps would dim before quickly returning to normal. Alongside this dimming environment, the flames in the fireplace either intensified or dwindled. The remnants in the kitchen were ignited and snuffed out. During this process, the glass windows in that room dimmed the most, and the fluctuations in the flames kept happening. However, the believers in the room were praying to the primordial moon, paying no notice to what was happening. After an unknown period of time, the crimson moonlight brightened a little, as though covering the entire city in a light veil. Such brightness quickly returned to normal as a scarlet-red flame flared up on a silver candle on a dining table. Enzo walked out of it as his body and face rapidly changed into German Sparrow. Just moments ago, at the instant when the crimson moon brightened, he had lost his target. Not only possessing the Beyonder powers of a high-sequence Beyonder of the Wraith pathway, but they can also borrow the power of the crimson moon. Regarding these two aspects, one of them is only possible with a sealed artifact or mystical item. Klein muttered silently and came to a preliminary judgment. After the demigod who possessed the doll had been corrupted by the death paper figurine, he had believed that he had the chance to take his opponent down. To his surprise, the enemy's strength and means available to them were more varied and potent than he imagined. The only thing he could confirm was that it wasn't an angel, as the strength and level were far inferior to one. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Klein left the dining room and entered the activity room. There were a few believers praying to the primordial moon. Unlike the cultists on the steam locomotive, they knew who they were praying to, as though they were more formal members of the parish. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps. Klein entered the room in an unhurried pace before they turned their heads when they noticed him. With the powerful illusion power of a bizarro sorcerer, they treated German Sparrow as an oracle that had descended upon them. They saw a bright moon halo at his head. The believers plopped to their knees in devout prostration. Klein didn't beat about the bush as he asked in a deep voice, "Who was the saint you met previously?" Although one of the believers was puzzled, he still respectfully answered, "Oracle, it was Shaman King Klarman." Shaman King Klarman. That's a familiar name. All right, the author of that book of secrets. Isn't he long dead? He was alive in a time over a millennium ago. Sense of non-special pathways have no way of living that long. He joined the Rose School of Thought but still believes in the primordial moon. Through some means, he has extended his life. Or could it be that his sequence alone affords him a long life? Klein's mind whirred and recalled the origins of the name Klarman. A sailboat was docked by the pier as the faint moonlight illuminated the cabin's interior. A figure with frizzled black hair with white streaks in them walked out of a mirror. He wore a back robe with crimson patterns. He had wrinkles that were neither too deep or shallow on his face. His eyes were bloodshot. At this moment, on the skin he exposed, such as the back of his hand, his paws had expanded, producing white feathers that were stained with pale yellow oil. This elder's expression was somewhat warped, as if he was enduring pain. He quickly sat on the bedside, bowed his head, clasped his hands, and silently chanted. In his jarring voice, his forehead slowly cracked apart, revealing a red full moon that seemed to be embedded in it. The moonlight dispersed and cloaked the elder, causing the white feathers on him to contract and recede into nothingness. But at this moment, his abdomen bloated up as though it was filled with liquid. Finally, his clothes, together with his skin, tore apart as a blob of flesh and blood covered in white feathers flew out onto the deck. After squirming for quite a while, it rotted and died. Phew! The elder looked up and slowly exhaled. His bloodshot eyes were filled with puzzlement. He muttered softly, "Death's blessed?" Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/lb-in.com. But death is no more. Early in the morning, the Church of Staun's mandated punishers, who had taken over the case of the mysterious deaths of the steam locomotive staff, had received new intelligence. The missing conductor and driver, as well as a few suspicious passengers, had been found. Before long, this mandated punisher team followed the clues and found their targets. They were silently hung outside a building in a row. "This is a provocation," the mandated punisher's captain growled through clenched teeth. But after they lowered the corpses and carried out their investigations inside the room, they saw that these people had been piously praying to the primordial moon in the activity room, holding a rather diabolical ritual. "Apprehend all of them." The mandated punisher captain issued a command after a second of surprise. The believers of the primordial moon seemed to regain their reason as they tried to resist. However, they were quickly suppressed, either dying or being injured in the process. The mandated punisher captain surveyed the area and inexplicably said to his peers, they didn't notice the row of corpses hanging at their doorstep. A member of the reader pathway thought and said, those corpses might have been left there to guide us to investigate the area. The mandated punisher captain calmed himself down and nodded in thought, which church's demigod passed by. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 969. Backland, Westborough, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had been summoned, took off his hat and coat and entered the activity room to wait. In this room, there were a few other Sanguine members who had been called by name to meet the important figure. After surveying the area, Emlyn picked a spot to sit in, right beside a man with a nose so high that it almost seemed deformed. Adorning his cut face was brown hair and red eyes. He held a comic in his hand, reading through it aimlessly. He was none other than the Sanguine who had provided Emlyn with the information about the ancient, abandoned castle in Delaire Forest. His name was Ernst Boyard, a Viscount. Emlyn had planned on visiting this Viscount in the next couple of days, but he never expected to bump into him here. After some careful consideration, he said in deliberation, "Your Lordship, I would like to know where you obtained the intel regarding the ancient abandoned castle in Delaire Forest." "Why? Did your client say that there weren't any ancient wraiths?" Ernst Boyard moved his gaze away from his comic and shot Emlyn a glance. "No, not at all." Emlyn didn't provide an explanation as he stubbornly emphasized his question again. "I'm just very curious of the source." "It doesn't seem that simple." Ernst Boyard closed his comic and nodded slightly. "It's not a secret. I learned of it from Lord Nibs. To be frank, I've never heard of this before. I find it hard to imagine that there's such an ancient castle in Delaire Forest." Lord Nibs. Emlyn instinctively had some thoughts arise in him. It's another test. But isn't such a test too dangerous? It even needed Mr. Fool to resolve it. Emlyn frowned slightly as he recalled the details he had contemplated previously. He probed, "Your Lordship, then why didn't you explore that ancient castle? I remember you being an archaeologist. And during this process, you'll be able to obtain the corresponding beyonder ingredients of an ancient wraith. Lord Nibs told me that it's very dangerous. One shouldn't approach it unless they're at the level of Earl." Emlyn's mouth gaped as his expression fell into a daze. He then held back his anger and asked with a suppressed voice, "Then why didn't you warn me?" Ernst laughed. "Isn't it obvious?" How can a location with beyonder creatures present, one that's known by us sanguine, still exist if not for special reasons? Emlyn fell into a daze as Ernst added, normal reasoning should be like this: ancient wraiths might exist in some place in Delaire Forest. People have encountered it before, but they were unable to find their origins. This means that finding those ancient wraiths is a very difficult and troublesome affair. The time cost exceeds their value, which allows them to live to this day. I thought you'd have easily discovered the problem with this reasoning. Likewise for your client. If they had chosen to take action, they must have had possessed the corresponding confidence. At that instant, Emlyn felt that Viscount Ernst made plenty of sense, and he could hardly rebut him. He believed that it was because he and Miss Magician were too foolish, resulting in her slamming headfirst into danger. It had nothing to do with him. The next instant, Emlyn felt embarrassed and frustrated, filled with anger towards himself. Finally, Emlyn figured out another problem. Regardless of whether the intel exposes any danger or not, Ernst Boyar should have clearly informed me of this point, because figuring out the level of danger, the source of danger, and how the danger manifested itself. It held immense importance in the subsequent exploration, one that can't be missed. He did it on purpose. Emlyn came to a final conclusion as his scarlet eyes narrowed. He raised his chin and said, "Indeed. It's easy to tell, but I'm more curious about the danger lurking in that ancient abandoned castle." Ernst picked up the black tea that nearly resembled the color of blood and sipped it. "I'm not sure either. Lord Nibs didn't mention anything." Emlyn's expression sank. Just as he was about to make a derisive remark, he suddenly saw Adora Cosme walk into the activity room and look at him. "Emlyn, it's time for the meeting." "All right." Emlyn reined in his emotions and pressed onto the bottom half of his vest, standing up unhurriedly. Following him down the stairs underground, he finally couldn't help but softly ask, "Baron Cosme, who am I actually meeting? How should I address him?" Cosme, who looked like a middle-aged gentleman, didn't hide the truth. He replied with deep respect, "Duke Ulmer. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Duke Ulmer." Emlyn subconsciously straightened his back and cast his gaze to the lamps on the wall. He appeared to use the reflection of the metal surface to check on his appearance. He was one of the 3 dukes that held up the Sanguine, an ancient powerhouse who existed before the Cataclysm. His title was Round Moon, with an age exceeding 3,000 years. He had once followed in the footsteps of ancestor Lilith. Without a doubt, this was synonymous with the history and glory of the Sanguine. After passing several secret doors, Emlyn and Cosme arrived inside a metal grey hall. The ground and walls were filled with green grass, flowers, and grain. Insects were crawling between the plants, making Emlyn feel as though he had left the city and arrived somewhere rural. He felt life thriving all around him. Such a scene didn't seem too odd, but on careful inspection, there were many strange points. The grass had mouth-like crevices with fibers flying out of them to capture the insects. The flowers used their leaves as hands to harvest pollen for themselves. The grains were heavy, occasionally emitting wailing from inside. There was a myriad spectrum of extraordinary insects. Some had snakes for heads, others birds. These things grew lusher the closer it was to the middle of the hall. Surrounding the area was a grave filled with exuberant spirits. Cosme faced the grave and reverently bowed. "Your Grace, Emlyn White is here." "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Emlyn didn't don his usual arrogance and was, in fact, a little flustered. Inside the grave, a mellow voice which didn't betray its owner's age chuckled. "A very outstanding young Sanguine. Cosme, you may leave for now." "Yes, Your Grace." Cosme bowed in response and left the metal grey hall that was filled with freshness. Emlyn stood there, listening to the mellow voice from the grave. "In the morning, Nibs informed me that you obtained the artificial vampire beyonder characteristic that corresponds to the Viscount title." "Yes, but it has been corrupted and requires purification." Emlyn hadn't mentioned the need to remove the mental corruption in the beyonder characteristics, because he believed that it was a trivial matter to the Sanguine. At the very least, Baron Cosme had previously confirmed that it was possible. Olma tersely acknowledged. Very well. I'll personally purify that characteristic. He paused before saying, although the sanguine enjoy a long life, we will still mature and grow old. There will be new births and deaths. Regardless, nurturing young members is a necessity for any race. As for the excellent talent and outstanding abilities you have recently showcased, they have made you a target we place great importance on. Therefore, I personally came to meet you to give you some tests so as to expedite your growth. Excellent talent and outstanding abilities. Emlyn raised his chin slightly higher once again. He then sighed inwardly. Indeed, just as Mr. Hanged Man determined, there will be a test and mission, as well as an interview. Amidst his overflowing emotions, Emlyn replied reverently, I'm always prepared. Not bad, Olma's mellow voice sounded from the grave. Your next mission is to find the key members of the Rose School of Thought that are hiding in Backland. There are very few clues for this, and many situations will require you to carry out the investigation by yourself. Rose School of Thought? They have a grudge with a sanguine? They seem to be taking in some believers of the primordial moon. Emlyn actually knew quite a bit about the Rose School of Thought via the Tarot Club, but he deliberately hid this without showcasing it. Apart from taking in believers of the primordial moon, they have in their possession one of the holy artifacts of a sanguine. It was something left by the ancestor. We need to retrieve it. There was a solemnity in Olma's voice. Left by the ancestor? Holy artifact of the sanguine. Emlyn didn't hesitate to say, Your Grace, I'll work hard to find the key members of the Rose School of Thought in Backland. Olma's voice turned mellow. Very good. Get some of the intel from Cosme in a while and seek out an incisive point. Emlyn was already eager to do so, but he still restrained himself, asking in deliberation, Your Grace, do you know about the abandoned ancient castle in Delaire Forest? You wish to head there? It's very dangerous, Olma said from inside the grave. Emlyn didn't explain as he directly asked, What kind of danger? Olma chuckled. That ancient castle might be older than me, even older than Delaire Forest. I do not know who built it. I only know that there's something sealed underground, and it hides an immense secret. Any creature that approaches it will be in danger of being corrupted by the force within. We once imagined that it has something to do with the abyss, but a devil suffered corruption after being thrown into the ancient castle as well, turning crazy and chaotic from his cold and cruel demeanor. Then why didn't you attempt to open the seal to figure out the situation? Emlyn mumbled inwardly but didn't say a word. Olma didn't speak further as he ended the conversation and dismissed Emlyn. In the evening, Backland was covered with dark clouds as a drizzle began falling. Emlyn White wore a hat and walked under a sheltered veranda, his scarlet eyes locked onto Viscount Ernst Boyar, who was browsing some antique stores. He was upset that Ernst had given him incomplete intelligence, so he had subconsciously tailed him after leaving the Odora villa. But after a while, he felt lost. He hadn't figured out how to deal with Ernst or how severe a lesson he should teach him. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 970. After blankly following Ernst Boyar for a distance, Emlyn White gradually abandoned his thoughts. He glanced at the area beyond the veranda as the downpour grew in intensity. He couldn't help but think, how should I punish Ernst? Although he had done so because he likely followed orders or a cue, it's still despicable. As for Lord Nibs, I presently do not have the ability. But wait, once I become a marquis or a duke, I'll definitely make him pay the price. Miss Magician has already completed her exploration of the ancient abandoned castle. I'm not sure if Lord Nibs had sent Sanguine to monitor the area. From her tone, description, and the feedback given by Mr. Fool, there was probably no monitors. Could it be that Lord Nibs didn't send any Sanguine to the vicinity of the ancient castle? But what's the point of such a test? Or could it be that they missed it because of some problems? Amidst his thoughts, Emlyn White felt that he needed to get someone to discuss the matter of punishing Ernst Boyar. He was severely lacking in such experience. Subconsciously, the first candidate of choice that came to him was the Hanged Man. This senior member of the Tarot Club was shown to be extremely experienced in various matters. He was extraordinarily reliable and had never left the other members disappointed. After hesitating for a few seconds, Emlyn struck down this choice. This was because this matter involved the Sanguine's internal test. To consult the Tarot Club members before he obtained an answer damaged his pride and overall image of the Sanguine. By the same reason, he eliminated the world as a choice. Of course, he believed he could guess the suggestion that the world would give, kill him. Discover updated novels on nove/e/elbin.com. There's no need to go that far. Emlyn mumbled inwardly. As he aimlessly tailed Ernst Boyar, he began expanding the candidates to the real world. Then, he realized he didn't have anyone to choose from. He almost had 0 friends. Eliminating his parents who were sanguine as well, he only had 2 or 3 people in mind. They were the Harvest Church's Father Utravsky and Detective Sherlock Moriarty, who had a mysterious background and a myriad of means at his disposal. Sherlock hasn't returned after leaving Backland. Sigh, I can only seek out Father Utravsky tomorrow. But I can't be that direct. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. He walked past Ernst Boyar, who entered a watch shop and headed for the end of the veranda where there were several rental carriages. Getting in the carriage, he felt the wheels turning. He casually glanced out the window and saw more raindrops striking the glass, drawing out trails that streaked down. In his blurred vision, carriages drove past. Audrey retracted her gaze from the rainy scene outside the carriage and glanced at her lady's maid, Annie, before communicating with Susie silently. The look in her eyes, her expression, and her not obvious body language said, "We're almost home." "I'm a little nervous." On the ground, Susie shook her tail, raised her paw, and adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. Together with the changes in the colors of her ether body and body of heart and mind, she expressed herself. "Don't worry. That Miss Galante, who's a psychiatrist on the surface, is only a telepathist. She won't be able to see through your lies." Audrey nodded gently and watched her carriage enter the Hall family's luxurious villa and stop in front of the sheltered foyer. Ever since joining the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation, she had begun spending less time at home. She had originally planned on meeting Escalante from the Psychology Alchemists at 22 Phelps Street in North Borough, but since Mr. Dwayne Dantes had left for the southern continent and wasn't in the foundation, there was no need for that. In the study she called her own, Audrey met Miss Galante Osalika, who had black hair reaching her waist and a baby face. "I must apologize. I'd been busy meeting up with friends after returning to Backland. My subsequent joining of the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation has delayed my meeting with you until today." After leaving Susie outside, Audrey elegantly bowed to express her attitude. In fact, this has been deliberate. By dragging out their meeting for about a month, her digestion of the psychiatrist potion and advancement to hypnotist became rather reasonable. It was the progress one would expect from a genius and nothing else. Escalante returned the greeting without much thought. "I heard that you have been busy with children who desire knowledge. Your virtues are more dazzling than diamonds." As Audrey gestured for her to sit, she walked to a single-seater and tersely acknowledged, "Those children are in situations I've never seen before. There's often a voice inside me that's urging me to do something. Miss Galante, if you're free, you can join me and the staff of the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation to go visit the different schools. There, you will get to see what most children in the world are experiencing." Having said that, she chuckled as though being self-deprecatory. "I apologize. I've recently been accustomed to kickstart such topics. It's because I wish for more nobles and the wealthy to involve themselves in such charities. I hope they can donate more to help even more children." After hearing Audrey, Escalante replied somewhat uncomfortably, "I will do so. I'll also donate some money to the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation." "No, I'm not forcing you to donate. This has to be an action that comes from the heart and something voluntary. I only wish for you to take a look and then inform the people around you of these children's plight and their possible futures. This includes the members of the Psychology Alchemists." Audrey shook her head, rejecting Escalante's suggestion. All right. Escalante first nodded gently in agreement before feeling that there was something ridiculous in this matter. Miss Audrey's true motives were to solicit donations from the psychology alchemists. But this was a secret, extraordinary underground organization. This was no different from soliciting donations from the Aurora Order. Audrey didn't continue discussing matters related to the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. Instead, she said, Miss Escalante, I have something I'd like to inform you of. What is it? Escalante read the solemnity, joy, and pride from her actions and emotions. Audrey smiled and said, I've already become a hypnotist. At that moment, Escalante suspected that Audrey had hypnotized her. Although she knew that Audrey had obtained the hypnotist potion formula previously, how long ago was that? You should be able to determine that I'm not lying, Audrey said with a smile. Only then did Escalante snap to her senses as she asked in surprise and doubt, You seem to have some extraordinary encounter? It's to have the courage to make use of matters. Audrey said things that couldn't be any true. Escalante frowned and said with some hesitation, You wish for the Sequence 5 potion formula? Yes. What do I need to do, or what price needs to be paid? Audrey didn't hide her motives. Escalante looked at the beautiful, blonde, and green-eyed lady in front of her and deliberated. This isn't something that's up to me to decide. I will report it and try to arrange for you to meet with Hilbert and Stephen. She was referring to psychologist and jewelry designer, Hilbert Alucard, and furniture merchant, Stephen Hamprez. Clearly, in this group of psychology alchemists members, Escalante was in a subordinate position. Audrey wasn't surprised by Escalante's reaction, but this didn't mean that her handling of matters wasn't without a problem. A Sequence 6 Beyonder who had the wish to advance was someone that required deep importance to be attached to in any secret organization. This was even the case with the Orthodox churches. They were people who were qualified to meet high-ranking members directly. This also meant that, after advancing to hypnotist, Audrey was already an elite in the middle-ranking members of the psychology alchemists. Her next goal was to become a quasi-high-ranking member. The person she needed to meet was a counselor of the Psychology Alchemists Council, and not Hilbert or Stephen. As her thoughts flashed across her mind, Audrey deliberately showed some of her displeasure. Escalante acutely noticed this and hurriedly explained, Meeting Hilbert and Stephen is to confirm your condition before a counselor meets you. In fact, with your present level, you should be leading a team and recruiting new members. But with your identity, status, and daily environment, we have cancelled that plan, afraid that it would influence your normal day-to-day life. Counselor. I wonder how many counselors from the psychology alchemists there are in Backland. Could it be the royal family's consultant of Inrambais? Audrey nodded in thought and said, I can understand that and will await your arrangements. She then diverted the topic and asked with a curious look, Miss Escalante, do you know what's the name of the Sequence 5 potion of the Spectator Pathway? Seeing this blonde, green-eyed, young noble lady taking on such a demure pose, Escalante silently heaved a sigh of relief. I've once heard Hilbert mention that it's called Dreamwalker. Dreamwalker. This is somewhat different from what I imagined. Or it could be that dream is just an analogy. To be precise, it should be subconscious walker? Audrey didn't conceal her contemplation and analysis before directing her questions to psychology and various information. After having Escalante stay for dinner, she sent the lady to the door where she got on a carriage. At this moment, it was dark outside with gales roaring and rain pouring. Amidst the pouring rain, howling winds, and the dark night, a steam sailboat hybrid was cruising through the safe sea route in the Berserk Sea with tourists on board. Klein had already left the southern continent and had returned to Desi Bay as Dwayne Dantes. Amidst the shaking ship, he suddenly woke up, got out of bed, and headed to the window of his first-class cabin's living room to look outside. Amidst the downpour, 3 huge strange pure black sailboats were silently cruising over. Hanging on their sides were lanterns with 3 black sails on masts almost 100 meters long. And on its deck stood a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high, its back facing the cabin. No one was sitting on it. It was the Black Emperor symbol of the King of the 5 Seas, Nast. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 971. On the observation deck of the liner, the bugle was sounded. It tore through the obstacles put up by the wind and rain, awakening all the passengers on board. Unable to dress up in time, they could only don a coat or their pajamas, rushing barefoot to the window to observe the situation outside. Half of the passengers quickly saw a gigantic sailboat that didn't adhere to common sense. They saw its 3 pitch-black sails and the blob of pale flickering yellow amidst the dark environment. Together with the howling winds, spattering rain, and the moonless and starless night sky, many passengers felt as though the ship was approaching them from hell, bringing with it an inexplicable sense of horror and dominance. After a brief pause and frenzy, a name surfaced in their minds: Black Emperor. Anyone who had been out at sea for some time, or people who lived in port cities in the various colonies, more or less knew the existence of such a pirate ship. Sigh, may the storm be with you and me. May the goddess watch over us. Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. Holy Lord of Storms. As the passengers subconsciously made prayers, they were filled with horror and helplessness. These passengers knew very well that the owner of the Black Emperor had the highest bounty on the 5 seas. In a particular sense, he was the king of pirates, and was a powerful figure who could remain alive despite the campaigns of the various fleets from different nations. He was definitely not someone the cannons and crew of a liner could resist. This meant that they were about to fall into the hands of pirates. Many women couldn't help but imagine being raped by the pirates and being sold to unfamiliar lands. Some trembled while others collapsed to the ground. Some rummaged for daggers or revolvers. It was unknown if they wanted to resist, or if they were unwilling to face the worst outcome. Having failed to find weapons, some moved a clothes rack to their side. The men didn't react any better. Apart from a number of them drawing weapons in a bid to organize themselves to resist, the remaining froze in a daze or sought places to hide. Others cursed the darn liner and the king of the 5 seas. Finally, the captain's voice boomed into the ears of every passenger via the broadcasting equipment or something else. Silence. Don't be afraid. The owner of the Black Emperor has his own code. He's not like other pirates. His subordinates can only plunder for items and wealth, nothing else. Such words were repeated a few times as the panicking passengers finally calmed down and no longer exhibited such horror. Compared to the outcomes they had imagined, being able to live and not be raped was an excellent outcome. Almost a minute late, a number of passengers were overwhelmed with sadness and cried upon realizing how their hard-earned savings would be wiped out. Some of them were doing business through loans. If they were unable to pay their loans, it was possible that their family would end up on the streets, relying on the workhouses for survival. Upon having this thought, they hurriedly took action and hid their wealth in all kinds of hidden compartments, hoping to keep as much as they could from the pirates. After doing this, they held their weapons tight, prepared to fight the pirates to the death at critical moments. Even feral beasts would fight back when cornered, why not humans? At this moment, many of the pirates on the Black Emperor were waiting by the broadside according to their orders. They were prepared to jump onto the prey once the distance was closed. Their second mate, Horror Viscount Bird Mustang, was holding a telescope as he observed the liner opposite him without much thought. He was inwardly calculating how much longer before the 2 ships met. This pirate, whose bounty had exceeded £10,000, wore an inty-styled shirt with complicated patterns on his sleeves and collars. He donned a dark red captain's attire, as though he was awaiting the commencement of a ball, and not a pirate attack. Suddenly, his vision blurred and he could no longer see the liner. Bird Mustang hurriedly searched with his telescope, but regardless of the direction he aimed it at, there was nothing but stormy waves and red-headed sea eagles who enjoyed hunting fish during storms. Such a huge liner had vanished. The light in Bird Mustang's eyes flickered as he failed to make an accurate judgment. Where's the ship? Where did such a huge ship go? It was still around. The pirates on deck also noticed something amiss as they exclaimed. A ghost ship? No, there aren't any ghost ships with such a make. This is a steam and sail hybrid that got popular in recent decades. An illusion? Someone had hidden a liner with a large-scale illusion? An illusion at this scale has to have been done by a demigod. Bird Mustang's thoughts raced as he retracted his telescope and headed for the cabin. During this process, the distance he traveled seemed to distort. In about 8 steps, Bird Mustang covered quite a sizable distance and arrived in front of the captain's cabin. He reverently bowed and said, "Earl Nast, something abnormal has happened with the hunt." On the Black Emperor, King of the Five Seas, Nast continued having himself addressed as an earl, as it was a title conferred upon him by Emperor Razel. Of course, he had publicly announced that it was a matter of time before he established a pirate's kingdom, becoming a duke, king, or even an emperor. After a brief silence, a solemn voice sounded from the captain's cabin. "Circle around it. By your will." Bird Mustang didn't ask why, as he directly accepted the order. Of course, he could imagine the reason. Be it an illusion or not, to make such a huge steam and sail hybrid liner vanish from the scrutiny of hundreds of pirates, it was definitely not something a low or mid-sequence beyonder could accomplish. The ship definitely had a demigod or a powerhouse wielding a demigod-level sealed artifact. And to clash with an unknown demigod for an ordinary liner was definitely an irrational act. Even if the Earl of White Maple Nast, as the King of the Five Seas, he wouldn't do such rash acts unless there was something worth fighting for. From this angle, the demigod was only hiding on the liner and had not launched any counterattack. This also implied that he didn't wish to clash with the Black Emperor and the King of the Five Seas. Therefore, he had only exhibited his existence for shock and awe purposes. Bird Mustang immediately got the sailors to leave the broadside and turn the Black Emperor around. At this point, a huge and heavy red-headed sea eagle suddenly flew out of its flock and headed for the Black Emperor, spiraling above the ghost ship. Amidst the pirates' confusion, the red-headed sea eagle looked down upon the deck and spoke deeply in a human's voice. "I wish to meet the Earl of White Maple." Bird Mustang was taken aback for a second before he cast his eyes at the cabin. King of the Five Seas Nast's solemn voice sounded again. Instead of directly answering the sea eagle, he instructed his subordinates, "Let him in." Bird Mustang immediately followed the order as the sea eagle swooped down in the storm. Its body gradually changed and turned into a humanoid form. When it landed on the deck, it was no longer a red-headed sea eagle, but a man with a tall top hat and tuxedo. His face wore a feathered mask. Bird Mustang's eyes dilated slightly as though he was trying to take in the figure clearer. But no matter how much he observed it, he was unable to discover anything abnormal about this exaggerated man. It was as though there wasn't a red-headed sea eagle from the very beginning. A few seconds later, Bird Mustang's pupils dilated even more because he saw the figure's side profile when it walked past him. This man, who appeared like he was an invitee at a banquet, was very thin. His side profile was about the width of 2 fingers. At that instant, Bird Mustang felt as though he was seeing a walking paper figurine, but it was also slightly thicker than one. A monster? He gulped with great difficulty as he watched the terrifying demigod walk towards the cabin. The pirates on deck quickly retreated and leaned against the shipboard as though a nightmare had just walked past them. To them, this abnormally proportioned man was something they had never seen before. It was more harrowing than the many monsters they had seen in the past. At the 3rd story of the cabin, outside the captain's cabin, Klein held the handle, twisted it, and opened the door. The reason he had made himself appear so strange was partially due to having no choice, but it was also partially deliberate. The former was because the red-headed sea eagle wasn't big enough, so after creating the clothes and mask, there was no way to create a normal human's body, even without the innards. The deliberate choice was because he was beginning to try out his theories on acting as a bizarro sorcerer. He had some ideas regarding this. The term sorcerer wasn't key. What was key was to use the methods of a sorcerer to appear bizarre. With a light creak, the dark black door opened, revealing the interior of the captain's cabin. Candle lamps drooped down from above, with 41 on the left and 40 on the right in an asymmetrical manner. At the end of it, a black platform rose up, surrounding an iron black chair. King of the Five Seas Nast's figure was relatively normal. He was slightly taller than 1.9 meters, unlike the non-human form which resembled a giant that Klein had previously encountered. He was still wearing a miniaturized crown with a black robe with silver ends. He had a squarish face with slight wrinkles. He had a short black mustache underneath his chin, and his black eye swirled with a red glow. It made one bow their heads without realizing it. "I've never met you before," Nas said in a deep voice, "Mr. Bizarro Sorcerer." Klein took off his hat and bowed. "You know me now." Nas made his voice, which made spirit bodies tremble, resound inside the captain's cabin. "Speak. Why are you visiting me?" "Emperor, I wish to know of your impression of Emperor Razel." "Everyone knows that you and your father have met him in the past far more than once," Klein replied without being affected. Nast swept the paper figurine-like demigod as his dark red light brightened significantly. "Have a seat first." Before he finished his sentence, Klein felt a potent suppressive force on him. His body involuntarily sat on a chair beside him. However, he was only here as a marionette. With a flick of the spirit body threads, the figure that was thin as a book had quickly restored its balance. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 972. With the pressure relieved, Klein casually pulled a chair over and placed it by the door, sitting opposite King of the Five Seas Nast, with the entire hall separating them. Although the Pirate King was more than 1.9 meters tall and was sitting on a black platform, allowing him to look down in a domineering manner, Klein didn't play second fiddle in this encounter. He wore his tall top hat again. After a brief silence, Nast, who had the official title of Earl of White Maple, said with a solemn tone, "Give me a reason why I should answer your question." Klein's thin body casually leaned back as he said, "You will not need to hear the same request when you have something you need to trade with me in the future." The dark red light flickered in Nast's black eyes as he said, "I basically know all the saints active in this world, but that doesn't include you." Klein caressed the feathered mask on his face and laughed. Without answering, he asked in return, "Have you met Zaratul?" "I've met him twice in Emperor Razel's palace." "I'd also interacted with quite a number of Secret Order members," Nast replied with a calm and direct but extremely domineering tone. "Quite a number of Secret Order members. You should introduce me to them when the opportunity arises." Klein couldn't help but quip. He then smiled and said, "I've also met Zaratul." Nast raised his hand to stroke his short black beard. His already tall figure seemed to burgeon, making the mood in the captain's cabin even gloomier and repressed. After a few seconds, he stared at Klein from above and said, "My impression of Emperor Razel is very simple. No one is more suitable than him to be the Black Emperor." He didn't explain what Black Emperor meant or pointed to, ignoring if the demigod opposite him understood or not. "Is that so?" From this King of the Five Seas' words, although the Emperor's diary implied that he made up his mind only in his later years to switch to the Black Emperor pathway and make preparations, he had long had such inclinations. He had unconsciously exhibited it and set up the situation ahead of time. Klein thought in enlightenment. He believed that Nast's impression of Emperor Razel was limited to that. After all, they had only met a few times. Hence, he switched topics. "In the Emperor's later years, did he get you or your father to do something secret?" Nast's crown shook a little as he replied, "Someone had once asked me the same question." Klein laughed and asked with a bold guess, "Bernadette?" "Yes." Nast held the two sides of his black throne with his hands. "Back then, she was very young and immature to ask such a question. With Emperor Razel's level in his later years, compared to handing something secret to me and my father, what could be kept more secret than doing it himself? This is implying that I'm as immature as Bernadette back then." Klein sighed and said, "To people who are concerned about this, one wouldn't abandon even the slightest sliver of hope." This was also why he wished to meet the King of the Five Seas after concealing the liner. He was now trying to find clues to the door of light above the grey fog in the real world. Apart from confirming who the third transmigrator was, he had to delve deep into Emperor Razel's matters. This was a necessary decision. The dark red glow in Nast's eyes contracted and expanded. "What's your relationship with Emperor Razel?" Klein thought and said with a sigh, "We can be considered old friends." After all, they had been above that mysterious door of light, and the cocoons they were in were neighbors with only a thin obstacle in between them. They had been hanging there for centuries or even millennia. This was a connection that stemmed from reality, and psychologically, having read so many of the Emperor's diaries, Klein had long treated the Emperor as a fellow countryman. He shared the same feelings for home and sense of identity with him. Nas stared at the thin demigod who sat by the door before he retracted his gaze and solemnly said, "Any more questions?" Klein was already prepared. He asked in an unhurried tone, "Do you feel that there was anything abnormal about Emperor Razel in his later years?" Fin new chapters on nov/elbin.com. The slightly wrinkled Nast remained silent for quite a while before saying, "I don't know enough about him, so I wasn't able to notice anything abnormal. The only thing that made me feel odd was that when me and my father met him, he would stand at a floor-to-ceiling window facing west. He would stare into the distance. This would happen in the morning, noon, and the evening. And that room wasn't the only one with a floor-to-ceiling window. West. Into the distance, the fog sea? Klein seemed to mutter to himself as though seeking confirmation. He recalled that the Emperor's diary had mentioned of a mysterious primitive island, and he recalled the abyss that hid somewhere in the fog sea. Nas nodded slightly and said, "That was my guess as well." Phew. Klein silently exhaled. After some consideration, he stood up and said, "I'm done with my questions. Please pardon me for my intrusion. Your lordship, I wonder if I can help you in a transaction?" He was fulfilling his promise. Nast fell silent for 2 seconds and said, "Help me find the card of blasphemy that corresponds to the Black Emperor." For an instant, Klein suspected that the Pirate King was testing him, but he immediately felt that an unknown demigod had little to do with the Black Emperor card. He said with a smile, "I'll try my best. However, the questions from before aren't worth a card of blasphemy. If I can obtain it, I'll trade you for the information inside it. Of course, I might only provide clues to that card." Nast caressed the armrest of his iron-black throne and said in a deadpan manner, "So be it." Klein took off his hat again, bowed, and turned to leave before returning to the deck. Under Horror Viscount Bird Mustang and Company's gaze, he raised his arms. His body rapidly contracted as the feather mask on his face spread out. In just 2 or 3 seconds, his entire person became an ordinary red-headed sea eagle. This sea eagle immediately flapped its wings, flying into the dark storm, vanishing from the sight of the pirates of the Black Emperor. "That's a demigod." Bird Mustang looked into midair and sighed. Although making a further advancement at Sequence 5 increased the inclination towards madness and a loss of control, making it highly possible for Beyonders to fail their advancement, the title of being a demigod remained attractive. As long as one successfully took the step, they could attain godhood, allowing their life to undergo a fundamental change. Be it in terms of lifespan or powers, it far exceeded that of humans, allowing them to reign above all. On the liner, Klein abandoned his control over the red-headed sea eagle, allowing it to plunge into the sea to be fish food without anyone seeing it. And at this moment, the passengers on board felt high-strung because the Black Emperor was about to approach. In fact, this should have happened a few minutes ago, but for some reason, the Black Emperor had ignored the liner and headed forward. Yet, the liner didn't use this opportunity to escape, and it had instead circled around the Black Emperor, maintaining a few hundred meters from it. This bizarre situation continued for a while before it finally ended, leaving dozens of meters between the two ships. The Black Emperor passed the liner and steered into the stormy night without returning. The passengers and crew watched blankly and realized the reality of the situation only a few minutes later. The Black Emperor was gone. He hadn't attempted to plunder them. A number of passengers cheered while others had tears stream down their faces. A few collapsed to the ground and relaxed. Only a few maintained their lucidity, feeling puzzled as to everything that had happened. However, they were unable to find an answer that agreed with the situation at hand. All they could do was console themselves. The Black Emperor must have completed a plunder already. Since this is a liner and not a cargo ship, it didn't catch its eye. As the euphoria spread across the ship, Klein, donning the appearance of Dwayne Dantes, cast his gaze to the north. Compared to King of the Five Seas Nast, who had only met Roselle a few times, there was another person who knew the Emperor even better, Queen Mystic Bernadette. Being an equal peer to Nast, she had recently been in Backland. After I return to Backland, I'll get Admiral of Stars to contact Queen Mystic and try to meet her as soon as possible. Klein retracted his gaze, drew the curtains, and went to bed. In the Rorsted Archipelago waters, on the future. Admiral of Stars Catlear finally received a letter from Queen Mystic Bernadette. She had no idea when the invisible messenger arrived, but this didn't stop her from effusing her joy. Tearing open the envelope and spreading open the letter, Catlear eagerly read the first line below the salutation. That's indeed Sile's descendant. That artisan is really Emperor Roselle's direct descendant. I can't allow him to mix with the believers of the primordial moon. I have to bring him on board the future. As Catlear thought, she nodded indiscernibly. After making up her mind, she thought of artisan Cielf's character and morals that only spelled trouble. She felt that she had the responsibility and duty to discipline him. Amidst her deliberation, she walked to the window of the captain's cabin and cast her gaze outside. After some searching, her gaze fell onto the shipboard where Frank Lee was munching on mushrooms. "Frank," Catlear shouted out with her normal tone. Frank, who had his sleeves rolled up, snapped out of his deep thought. "Captain, is there something?" Catlear said seriously, "I'll get you an assistant for your experiments." Frank was taken aback before he revealed a pure smile. "All right." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 973. Upon seeing Frank's smile, Catlear had mixed feelings. She then retracted her gaze and turned it to the nearby fishing village where the future was docked. No one expected this place to be an important base of the Moses ascetic order. To avoid the pursuit of the Aurora Order, Catlear and her crew had been docked here recently. She wasn't in a rush to set sail, but was prepared to go ashore. She planned on using the equipment in the fishing village to make contact with her subordinates who were monitoring artisan Cielf in Byam. Through that, she could confirm the situation and make plans. Only with this in place could the future set sail again, headed for the capital of the Rorsted Archipelago, Byam, that was several days away. In Backland, the sky brightened especially early in July, but the overall temperature wasn't considered hot. It didn't even exceed 30 degrees Celsius. Emlyn wore a top hat to shelter him from the sunlight that penetrated the clouds as he disembarked a carriage and walked into the Harvest Church. Looking over, he saw the mountain-like Father Utravsky, who wore a brown priest robe and a clergyman's bonnet. He was standing in front of the sacred emblem of life, preaching to the few believers that came to pray in the morning. Emlyn didn't take a second look as he walked straight to the back of the cathedral. He arrived in a room that he called his, and he familiarly changed into his priest robes. As he wiped the candle stands, he waited for the believers to leave. About 20 minutes later, he finally found an opportunity to sit beside Bishop Utravsky and muttered to himself while looking at the sacred emblem of life, "Father, I have a question I would like to consult you about." The thin-browed, light blue-eyed Bishop Utravsky with some clear wrinkles replied with a smile, "Go ahead." Emlyn held his breath and verbalized the words he had been thinking over the entire night. I'm saying, if there's a distant relative who fools you, making you and your friend fall into danger and almost lose your life, and this matter isn't suitable in court, how would you punish him? Despite sitting down, Utravsky remained like a hill. He said in a deep but gentle voice, "First, you have to confirm if the relative had made a mistake due to negligence, or if he had deliberately fooled you and lead you into a trap. If it's the former, you need to warn him, remind him, and teach him, instead of thinking of punishing him. If it's the latter, you still need to confirm if this is the way he usually does things. If it is, then you need to eliminate him. Otherwise, he will definitely bring more harm to others, bringing harm to innocents. By ending his life and sending him back to the land, it will restart the cycle of life. It's a type of compassion and a type of purification. Elimination. Father speaks of murder in a way that's more natural, mellow, and calmer than the world." Emlyn's facial muscles twitched as he hurriedly interrupted Utravsky's reply. "No, he usually doesn't act this way." It's just that due to various reasons, he had targeted me this once. I don't wish to kill him because of this. Just as he said that, Emlyn froze. He had apparently, probably, most likely, just expressed the fact that he was the victim, expressing that this matter was a sanguine internal matter. Yutravsky turned to look at him and revealed a smile. Not bad. You already understand how precious life is. Emlyn forced a smile. Then, how should he be punished? Yutravsky looked at the sacred emblem of life in front of him. I do not advocate appealing to violence. You can bring him here and have him listen to my preaching and reading the Bible. He will understand the value of life and experience the compassion of Earth Mother. He will serve to redeem his sins. Isn't this what I experienced? Emlyn was taken aback before realizing that this method was in line with his intentions. This neither caused Ernst Boyar's death, nor was it comparable to simply beating him up and demanding compensation. More importantly, this wouldn't escalate to a conflict that would cause strife among the sanguine. Of course, every method had its flaws. To Emlyn, the biggest problem was, how was he to bring Ernst Boyar to the Harvest Church? From the moment he began doing volunteer work here, all the sanguine in Backland knew to avoid this region. Ernst Boyar was no exception. It was impossible to trick him into coming in. And if he resorted to violence, Emlyn believed that, with the ring bestowed to him by Ancestor Lilith, as well as Miss Magician's powerful spellbook that could be rented, defeating Ernst Boyar wasn't a difficult endeavor. However, to control him wasn't simple. After all, he was a sanguine viscount, equivalent to that of a sequence 5 beyonder. In addition, although Ernst Boyar wasn't too old, he had quite a collection. Under such circumstances, the extent of which to directly taking action was hard to gauge. It could easily lead to death, and Emlyn would be blamed for. Perhaps I need some help. In Backland, there are many members of the Tarot Club. If we work together, we should be able to easily control Ernst. I can't expose my identity because of this. The cooperation should be done in stages, so that we don't have to meet. Amidst his thoughts, Emlyn had made his decision. He planned on assigning a mission during the tarot gathering next week in search for help. He nodded gently in response to Father Yutravsky's suggestion. It sounds pretty good. I plan on making a decision a few days later after calming down. Father Yutravsky nodded and smiled. Fruits are obtained from planting them. It's a long process that requires patience. From the looks of it, you have understood this point. Of course, it's such a simple principle. Emlyn raised his chin slightly as he habitually clasped his hands and prayed to the sacred emblem of life. 22, Phelps Street, Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. Audrey placed a document in hand on the table and looked up at the wall clock in the director's office. She could hardly relax. She had already made an appointment with Escalante to head over to Stephen Hampers's residence in the afternoon. Clearly, this meant a test. If the Psychology Alchemists' team was careful enough, they would have already reported the news, and there might be a counselor secretly observing everything. Based on her current level and abilities, although Audrey was unable to determine how terrifying a high-sequence spectator was, she could imagine the kinds of performance they had in certain domains. This made her uncontrollably nervous, afraid that she would be seen through. In fact, I should have delayed it a little more. Although the time and the emotions I showed are in line with logic in psychology, delaying a meeting would definitely incur suspicion. But compared to a little bit of suspicion, it's more important to wait for Mr. World to return from the southern continent. That way, I can directly arrange for them to meet at the Foundation. I don't have to worry about a high-sequence spectator discovering anything. Sigh, Audrey, your plans weren't well thought enough. Audrey sighed silently and cast placate on herself to calm her emotions. After the afternoon, she wasn't in a rush to leave the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. Sitting inside her office, she bowed her head, clasped her hands together, and softly prayed to Mr. Fool. After completing this, she got onto her carriage with Annie and Susie, heading for the residence of the furniture merchant, Stephen Hampres. Just as the carriage began moving, Audrey suddenly saw a gorgeous beam of light appear. Amidst the beam of light, a 12-winged angel bathed with golden light descended. The wings, which were made of flames, had wrapped her in layers before they dissipated layer after layer. Audrey's vision quickly recovered as she swept her gaze past Annie and Susie through the corner of her eye in an unnoticeable manner. She realized that they hadn't noticed anything that had happened. It's a little different from the previous angel. With Mr. Fool's greater reawakening, his angels have also recovered further. As the corners of her lips quivered, Audrey wiped the smile from her face, her inner heart becoming abnormally firm. In less than half an hour, her carriage had stopped by Stephen Hampers's door. After passing her hand to Annie, Audrey was helped down the carriage, and she walked straight to the door. She watched as her attendant pulled the doorbell. Before long, Escalante came to open the door. Like before, she directly brought Audrey to the activity room on the first floor. Annie and Susie were brought to the living room by the servants. Upon arriving at the activity room, Escalante reached out to hold the doorknob as she gestured for Audrey to enter. Audrey had a guess, but she didn't show it. She slowly walked through the door which Escalante had opened. Escalante didn't enter as she closed the activity room's door. Audrey looked ahead and saw that on a single seater facing the activity room's door, there was an elder sitting there quietly. The elder wore a shirt, vest, and a jacket, matched with blue-gray trousers with lines adorning it, as well as a dark red bow tie. His hair was completely white, but remained thick and lush. He had a warm and elegant bearing. He had a pair of blue eyes that seemed to hide wisdom and knowledge. Apart from the wrinkles on his forehead, he didn't have any wrinkles elsewhere. Audrey knew him. He was the royal family's consultant Vin Rambais. Of course, Audrey had long known of this old gentleman's secret identity from the Tarot Club, a counselor of the psychology alchemists. She didn't disguise her surprise, because she truly was surprised. Although she had guessed at the possibility of Vin Rambais' appearance, she never expected him to appear directly. She imagined that he would observe her in secret, allowing Hilbert and Stephen to speak on his behalf. "You're very surprised?" Vin Rambais asked with a faint smile. He then stood up and bowed. "A pleasure meeting you, Miss Audrey." Audrey deliberately opened her mouth before closing it again. Following that, she replied with a mixed smile, "I'm not sure how I should address you." Vin Rambais chuckled. "Like always." He pointed to the sofa beside them. "Let's have a seat." Audrey took a deep breath, wore a smile, and unhurriedly walked over. Sitting by the sofa, she maintained an adequate distance from him. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 974. Vin Rambais picked up the porcelain teacup and took a sip. Looking at Audrey, who sat in a flawless posture, he said genially, "There's no need to act so reserved. This isn't our first meeting. I still recall discussing Berman's philosophy of ethics and Kongsoka's pragmatism with you 2 years ago." Audrey smiled faintly and said, "I just find it difficult to put the idea of you and a psychology alchemist's counselor together." Vin Rambais hadn't introduced himself, but it was a reasonable inference based on Audrey's knowledge of the psychology alchemists and the present situation. Vin crossed his right leg and said with a smile, "This isn't something worth paying attention to. Never forget that our psychology alchemists is an organization established with the goal of studying the psyche and to build knowledge. We are more about the academic side of things rather than handling matters. Since it's academic, you can always treat a counselor as a university's professor." If she hadn't learned from Mr. World that Vin Rambais was behind Couron's suicide, Audrey would have been able to conclude that he was a knowledgeable, amiable, humorous, and humble scholar, regardless of the amount of observation that she did. However, since she was wary, Audrey wasn't someone who would so easily believe things that appeared on the surface. As she looked at him and organized her words, she prevented herself from focusing too much on one point. She kept her thoughts lively and scattered to prevent herself from being hypnotized. At this moment, her mind suddenly turned adrift. She seemed to see the 7 pure lights that contained infinite knowledge and the dense, indescribable figures. She saw them blanketing everything from high above. This was the spirituality sky, the reflection of the spirituality in one's mind. And beneath the spirituality sky was a deep, dark sea. Every drop of water resembled a point of light, as though they represented an imprint on each subconscious. Near this sea were several islands. One of them belonged to Audrey. She clearly knew that this was a manifestation of her consciousness. What was exposed above the sea was what she could detect, and the parts covered by the seawater were her deeper consciousness that she was usually unable to grasp or know. Floating above the island, Audrey looked to the bottom. She first noticed that the area was a solitary, quiet, grey blur. They screened out her vision, making her only capable of seeing the massive and dark black outlines of the subconscious, as well as the illusory and rippling sea of collective subconscious. She was unable to obtain much information from that. Audrey was puzzled as to how she had entered this strange state when she saw large swaths of grey split apart like the sea deep in the sea of subconscious at the island below. It revealed a stone platform that had appeared at some point in time. On the platform, a figure grew up rapidly in a fashion akin to blinking, entering Audrey's field of view almost instantly. His hair was completely white but remained thick and lush. He wore a standard three-piece suit, matched with blue-grey trousers with lines adorning it, as well as a dark red bow tie. This man with deep wrinkles on his forehead was none other than Havin Rambais. Compared to the Havin sitting on the sofa, he appeared more sinister. He didn't wear a smile, and his head was slightly bowed. It was as though he was observing Audrey's subconscious that lay behind. In a few steps, he walked into Audrey's island of consciousness through the sea of collective subconscious. Then, he went from the subconscious to the area exposed above the sea like a silent visitor who didn't knock on the door or receive any permission. After arriving on the island, Havin Rambais raised his head. His facial skin was already covered in greyish-white scales. His irises were gold and vertical, and it didn't show any hint of emotion. Floating in midair, Audrey observed this scene and fully understood the situation she was in. This was the world of the mind, a mind world formed by the spirituality sky, sea of collective subconscious, and the island of consciousness. Due to the blessings from Mr. Fool's angel, Havin Rambais's intrusion of my body of heart and mind and psyche through the sea of collective subconscious sounded alarms. That force has separated my most fundamental part of my self-conscious, allowing me to control everything on the island from the spirituality sky. Thus, I'm able to truly resist true forms of telepathy. How magical, no, how despicable of Havin Rambais. He's not polite at all. He intruded into my house without gaining any permission or providing any notification. Audrey grumbled in midair. After understanding her current situation, she secretly controlled the changes that were influencing the island while answering the casually seated Havin Rambais in the real world. I'm also very reserved when facing university professors. As she spoke, Audrey made her inner island mumble. This isn't a good analogy. As an elderly psychology alchemist's counselor, he should be a sequence for at least. This is a demigod, one that naturally makes one feel fear, or unreserved. On the sofa, Havin Rambais chuckled immediately. Then I won't be forcing you. I've heard about you from Hilbert. I heard that you've advanced from psychiatrist to hypnotist in a short few months. I'm very curious about how you did it. Oh, I've also heard of the answer you gave Escalante having the courage to make use of matters. However, I wish to hear something more detailed. At this moment, the Havin Rambais on Audrey's mind island was observing his surroundings with a deadpan expression, listening the resonating voice. Audrey was already prepared for this as she deliberately pretended to be organizing her words. After a few seconds, she said, "It's just the superficial meaning of having courage to make use of matter." Let's put it this way. In my future plans, I've always had one of my options being a psychiatrist. Since I've acquired the corresponding Beyonder powers, I was definitely very happy to try it out and help the people around me resolve their mental and psychological problems. While saying that, she showed some signs of embarrassment towards such actions that bordered on childishness. Her mind island faithfully reflected this. After a pause, Audrey continued, "During this process, I discovered that my control over the potion's powers became better until, one day, I felt something in me shatter and fuse into my blood. It also allowed me to vaguely see illusory stars. Mr. Rambies, what does it represent? For some reason, I firmly decided to become a hypnotist from that day. This might also be a cue from my subconscious. After saying that, Audrey deliberately stuck out her tongue on her mind island like when she was little, doing things she usually wouldn't do. It was a way to prove that she was feeling a little embarrassed because playing psychiatrist was no different from playing princess when she was little. An embarrassment often meant the truth. Avin Rambies nodded gently and said, "Very talented. You seem to have figured out the acting method by yourself." Acting method? Audrey wore a surprised and blank look both inside and outside before coming to a realization. Avin Rambies said with a genial smile, "It's exactly as you think it is. By acting based on the potion's name and concluding the corresponding principles, that will speed up the digestion of the potion. It is an effective method for reducing the negative influences. However, before Sequence 6, we do not teach it because we do not advocate members using this method to accelerate the digestion of their potions. Surprisingly, you have figured it out yourself. Why don't you advocate it?" Audrey asked sincerely out of curiosity. Avin Rambies sighed and said, "This will make the members not be themselves. Some might even be assimilated by the remnants of the potion. To put it simply, the first 3 sequences are for one to slowly grasp their powers and get used to being extraordinary. It allows one's subconscious to be deeper, become clearer, and turn more mature. It aids in resisting the subsequent problems that come from the acting method. Of course, I can only give my opinion on the spectator pathway. As for the other Beyonder pathways, I'm not too sure if they're the same. But clearly, pathways that focus on the domain of the mind would have some differences in the area of self-consciousness. Discover updated novels on NOVE/E/Elbin.com. Audrey was unable to determine the veracity of Avin Rambies' words. She felt that there was definitely some reason to it, but it was not entirely the truth. Little Sun mentioned before that one key thing to remember regarding the acting method is remember that you're only acting. I find this more appropriate. Yes, I've been strictly abiding to it, and will keep doing so in the future. Audrey, you mustn't be careless. From this moment forth, you must put more emphasis on your self-consciousness. From Mr. Fool's point of view, this must be trivial and doesn't require additional emphasis since it's included in the statement of only acting. But to the ordinary person, perhaps it's relatively more important." As Audrey's thoughts raced, she asked, "Can you explain the acting method in more detail?" Avin Rambies explained it to her in a relatively more detailed manner before saying, "You are indeed talented and qualified to obtain the Sequence 5 Dreamwalker potion formula, but before that, I'll give you several missions. This is out of fairness and also a form of training for you. This is because once you achieve Sequence 5, you will be leading 2 to 3 psychological discussion groups. Your every judgment and choice will influence the future and even the lives of the members beneath you. Therefore, we mustn't allow people who deeply lack experience in handling matters to advance to Sequence 5. Understandable." Audrey didn't object to it. "What's the first mission?" Avin Rambies said with a smile, "A simple but rather long-term mission. Every piece of feedback you provide will count towards your contributions." At this point, he sighed. The fracture between the new party and the Conservative Party is widening. The more conflict there is, the more divided the kingdom's internal politics will be. I wish that you can take note of the attitude of your father, Earl Hall. Inform me of some of his views towards various bills and matters. Don't worry, this will not cause him any harm. We only wish to mend the fractures." His final statement was, in fact, not supported by logic. It was solely a promise. But with Avin Rambies raising his right hand to his temples while on Audrey's mind island, Audrey felt that what he said was very reasonable and deeply relatable. Floating above her mind world, she immediately snapped to her senses and realized something was amiss. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 975. How can you not cause harm to my father from knowing his trump cards? This will bring about negative impacts to matters that he's trying to push for or object to. Floating in the mind world, Audrey looked down at her island of consciousness. Her thoughts were so calm that it surprised her. Right on the heels of that, she suddenly realized why Havin Rambais had directed Kuaron's suicide. Audrey had always been concerned about this matter. Furthermore, she had obtained information from various sources, giving her a rather clear idea of the overall picture. However, she had ultimately been stumped about the mastermind's goal. This trap seemed to be targeted at the purse strings of the Conservative Party, Baron Sindras. As long as he failed to respond properly, this powerful banker would have his problems exposed and end up handled by the official Beyonder organizations. However, the actual process seemed to lack the panache of a high-sequence Beyonder of the spectator pathway. It was especially so when Dwayne Dantes reacted unexpectedly, causing the plan to immediately be foiled, yet there wasn't any mending of the plan. As a rather senior spectator, Audrey had long noticed the incongruity within this matter. However, it was only after hearing Havin Rambais' words today that she realized the core of the matter. Havin Rambais didn't care if he had successfully taken down Baron Sindras, as he had already accomplished his goals. It was just as he had said, the new party and Conservative Party were fractured. Although Havin Rambais claimed to be trying to mend it, his true goal was to deepen the cracks and cause them to completely fall out with each other. Why is he doing this? Audrey controlled her mind island and didn't make it show any puzzled emotions. She then replied to Havin Rambais, I can understand your concern for the kingdom's political situation. I will work hard on this. Just as she said that, the gloomy Havin Rambais on the mind island lowered his right hand from his forehead. Havin Rambais, who was sitting on a sofa in the real world, said with a gladdened smile, you are indeed a young noble lady filled with compassion. With that said, the old gentleman lowered his right leg, which was covered by greyish-blue trousers with lying patterns. He leaned forward slightly as his eyes grew darker. Due to your identity and daily environment, you shall forget about me. You will only remember Hilbert, Stephen, and Escalante. You will pass any information through them. When there are extremely pressing issues that need reporting, you will subconsciously visit me with the excuse of consulting me on some academic question. When you enter my room, your lost memories will recover. As Havin Rambais said those words, the him on Audrey's mind island opened his mouth and repeated the words. A rock took form and quickly plunged into the ground, sinking into the subconscious. At that moment, Audrey felt as though she had dissociated into two entities. One was a result of a mind island. She could no longer remember the appearance or name of the elder in front of her. She only knew that she had come to Stephen Hampers's residence and met a psychology alchemist's counselor, where she received the approbation of the acting method and received a new mission. Another her floated beneath the spirituality sky, acutely aware of everything that had happened. However, there wasn't much emotional changes. It was more optimistic than gloomy. Audrey was certain that the one in midair was her true self-conscious. Therefore, she didn't feel confounded. With her as the true self, she controlled her other self and got up in a muddle. Yes, sir. After answering him, she rapidly straightened her body, and like a puppet who was being controlled by invisible strings, she walked to the door and left. At the instant she closed the door, the her in the mind world sky and the her corresponding to the island of consciousness fused as one. There were no longer any differences. The two entities with certain memory discrepancies instantly fused together, giving Audrey a few seconds of confusion. However, with plenty of experience in treating people and hypnotizing others, she very quickly and skillfully identified the differences. She then reconstructed every detail from before. What powerful mind-reading and hypnosis! He directly entered my body of heart and mind and even my soul body to exert influence via the sea of collective subconscious. Although Audrey had the blessings of the Fool's Angel, she felt that her recollections were like viewing old photographs. They were yellowed and faded, as though they were matters that happened years ago. I'll be able to do the same in the future. The blessings of Mr. Fool's Angel is really impressive. Humph, I'll only inform you of Father's take on unimportant matters. As Audrey's mind whirled, her mood turned for the better. Whoosh! The steam locomotive that spewed out copious amounts of smoke dragged its carriages as it chugged into Backland. After traveling for days, Klein had finally returned to this capital of capitals. As Dwayne Dantes, Klein wore a top hat and a formal suit while holding a gold-inlaid cane. He slowly left the first-class cabin and firmly stood on the platform. Behind him was a man with mixed blood. He was about 1.75 meters tall, and he carried 2 luggage bags. He was none other than the marionette, Enzo. Of course, this winner had already changed his name to Enunai, which sounded more in line with the southern continent's traditions. In the future, he would be the go-to person to establish contact with the southern continent's clientele for the upstart tycoon and arms dealer, Dwayne Dantes. The non-crucial business would be handled by him, without needing Dwayne Dantes to personally head to East and West Balam. Of course, this was simply a disguise. In fact, Klein would be the one making the trip. He had decided to send believers to West Balam in the name of sea god Calvetua and get them to represent himself to complete some small-scale deals. After all, Danitz was an infamous pirate over the 5 seas, with a bounty exceeding £10,000. Furthermore, he had close ties with German Sparrow, and it easily incurred suspicion if he kept helping Dwayne Dantes. After leaving the station, Klein rode a carriage and returned to 160 Boakland Street. It was already dark by then. The street lamps on both sides of the street had already lit up, likewise for Dwayne Dantes' residence. Butler Walter and housekeeper Tunaja led the male and female servants, as well as the gardener and coachman, out. They stood on both sides to welcome their employer back. After he arrived in Desi Bay and bought the train tickets, Klein had sent a telegram back to Backland, informing his butler when he was returning. However, he had instructed him not to send the coachman to pick him up at the station. After all, this was an era when steam locomotives were often delayed. It wasn't impossible that its arrival would be delayed to the next morning. Glancing at his servants who stood with a standard, reverent pose, Klein secretly nodded and passed through them as he sighed inwardly. This does resemble the style of nobility. Even when the employer isn't around, the butler doesn't skive. When he arrived at the door, he nodded gently at Walter and Tunaja before saying, "It must have been hard on you while I was away." "It's our duty," Walter and Tunaja said with a bow. Klein then turned his gaze to his valet, Richardson. He realized that this good-looking mixed blood had a somewhat pale expression as he kept stealing glances at his employer's new valet, Enunai. Klein smirked inwardly as he nodded at him. "You did well. However, there's some business involving the southern continent that requires Enunai to handle it." "Oh yes, be Mr. Walter's assistant and help him in gathering information for a manor outside the city." "Assistant? Assistant butler?" Richardson was first taken aback before he replied in pleasant surprise, "Yes, sir." With this role, it meant that he had broken free from the constraints of being a valet. He had been promoted. Walter didn't ask about the manor in detail as he seriously arranged for his employer's settling in, bath, and meals. After all of this was done, he and Enunai sent Dwayne Dantes back to the 3rd story before he asked, "Sir, do you plan on buying a manor in the suburbs of Backland? What requirements do you have?" "Something not too expensive. Who knows how long I can use this identity for?" Klein inwardly gave a self-deprecating comment before deliberating. "One with a vineyard and brewery." Fin new chapters on nov/elbinin.com. After completing the arms deal, he had already established himself in Backland's high society and had earned a huge sum of money. Therefore, it was necessary for him to own a manor. He couldn't afford to not be capable of inviting his friends on a vacation and hunt in the suburbs when autumn and winter came. This was a faux pas that could easily make him be viewed with scorn. Furthermore, the manors in Backland suburbs were rather expensive. One could purchase a huge manor with rubber trees in places like Desi Bay for £8,000 to £10,000, but here, all he wanted was a vineyard and grain farm, with facilities like a brewery. "I will gather the information as soon as possible," Walter replied respectfully. He knew his employer was exhausted from his traveling, so after briefly informing him of the recent developments, he left the 3rd story and busied himself on other matters. With the new valet's help, Klein changed his clothes and washed up. During this process, Klein, who had gotten accustomed to his guardhood, couldn't help but lampoon. If it wasn't because a marionette cannot be more than 1,000 meters from me, would I have changed valets? Despite being a tycoon, I still have to serve myself. Sigh. Amidst his sighs, he dismissed Winner and Uni to the adjoining room and walked to the window. He looked at the lamplit backland, which resembled stars, as he allowed his thoughts to wander. Next, my goal is MI9's Deputy Director, Brigadier General Conas Kilger. As for the Captain of the Royal Guards, Viscount Stratford, I can leave him to the Demoness, Trissy. She has vanished for quite some time. I wonder what he has been busy with. I wonder if she has come up with a way to approach that Viscount. I had previously informed her that I have other matters to tend to and wasn't free via the method she gave me. I'll later have to confirm that I'm free now and can continue our previous cooperation effort. After a while, Klein reined in his thoughts and got into bed. Without the help of cogitation, he fell deep asleep. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly opened his eyes and sensed that someone had entered 160 Beauclun Street. Here it comes again. Klein couldn't help but raise his hand to rub his temples. On the first day of returning to Backland, he had been awakened in the middle of the night. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 976. Dressed in pajamas, Klein didn't move. In his spiritual perception, the intruder's spirit body threads appeared. This also meant that if he so wished, he could turn everyone in 160 Beauclun Street into his marionette without leaving the bed. Of course, to a demigod a bizarro sorceroth neighbors a few buildings away were within range. There are many spirit bodies around. One of them is helping him fly. He has landed on the opposite balcony. Is it a beyonder from the death pathway or the Evernight pathway? To be able to do this, he must at least be a sequence 6. Is here for Richardson? No, he's walking towards my bedroom. He has paused and has reached out his right hand to knock gently on my door. He's certain that I detected him? Klein sat up with a slightly heavy expression. He had made the initial judgment via the spirit body threads, but subsequently, he did it via direct sight, a scene that formed in his mind. After Klein reached sequence 4, not only was his danger premonition as a clown enhanced, the amount of power he could stir and use from the mysterious space above the grey fog had experienced a qualitative boost. With the two combined, it wasn't difficult for him to use his intuition to have a projection of the intruder's figure and actions, despite the distance. In addition, due to his deepened control over the mysterious space, Klein could converge the augmentation effects the grey fog had on him in the real world. This prevented beyonders of certain pathways from seeing anything. Based on his judgment, by being above the grey fog, augmenting himself with a card of blasphemy, and using the sea god scepter, the strength that the fool could direct at the real world was asymptotically closer to that of an angel. If that weren't the case, even if the grey fog and the paper figurine substitutes could allow others to maintain their lucidity in dreamlike states, Klein wouldn't have dared to allow Miss Justice to face a sequence 4 or even sequence 3 of the spectator pathway. Amidst his thoughts, he left his bed, wore his slippers, and straightened his pajamas. He walked to the reclining chair and leisurely sat down. Please come in. The door to the master bedroom opened silently, but no cold wind blew in. All it did was spiral in the corridor. The visitor was a man about Dwayne Dantes' age and of similar height. He had black hair and brown eyes. He had cut facial features, a classic example of a Lonese man. He wore a silk top hat and had a rather thin face. His demeanor was cold but wasn't one that left others feeling uncomfortable. Instead, it was a manifestation of the night view at a suburban cemetery. At this instant, Klein saw countless spirit bodies hugging a middle-aged gentleman. It made his surroundings dark and stacked, as though a world was hidden within. Klein's spiritual intuition told him that this was a demigod. Why would there be a demigod coming to me moments after I arrive back in Backland? Apart from the Church of Evernight's Backland Archbishop, nothing has been exposed in regards to this identity as Dwayne Dantes. Having a headache, Klein looked at the door without an expression. It was unknown whether he was feeling angry or alarmed. After taking 2 steps, the demigod's right hand suddenly hung down straight. Together with his waist, it bent like a bow pulled to its limit. He had bowed deeply in a strange manner, his attitude extremely reverent. Meanwhile, a cold wind blew over, closing the door silently. Klein was nearly taken aback, feeling at a loss. His mind whirred as he came to a rough guess. Updated chapters on novelbin.com. At this moment, the demigod maintained his pose and said in a deep voice, in response to a revelation, "I, Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate, am here to meet your excellency." Revelation. Klein controlled the twitching of his facial muscles. Together with his previous guess, he had a rough understanding of what was happening. The Evernite goddess had deepened her control of artificial death, in other words, the death pathway's uniqueness. She was able to give revelations to the high-ranking members of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Klein sighed as he chuckled. He pressed his right hand to his chest, but he didn't make any additional movements. What is God's revelation? Bryan slowly stood straight and looked at the gentleman with the white sideburn sitting at the reclining chair. He replied with some level of fervor, "We succeeded. God has finally awakened. He has requested me to listen to your commands from this day forth and to follow your arrangements." Klein had already expected this, but he felt his face burn, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "This is making me be a blessed of Evernite while also part-timing as a blessed of artificial death, so as to silently lead the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Is this a bestowment of fate or a price that had been exacted? Since the goddess didn't get the church's archbishops or high-ranking deacons to handle this matter, it means that she wishes it to be kept confidential." Klein instantly stood up and tried to appear pious in tone and expression. "As God's revelation commands. God's wish is my wish." After expressing his devotion, he looked at the demigod standing straight in front of him and pointed to the sofa opposite him. "Please have a seat. Oh, do introduce yourself. That's the most basic form of politeness, isn't it?" Moments ago, as the thoughts ran through his mind, Klein had vaguely grasped the reason why the goddess had handed him leadership over the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. As German Sparrow, he had close connections with the Death Consul. Therefore, if anyone were to really discover anything amiss and begin investigating the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction, they would realize that it had something to do with German Sparrow and be enlightened. They would believe that they had grasped the truth as to why artificial death was able to come to life and send a revelation. Due to this guess, Klein deliberately made Dantes use German Sparrow's usual speech. Patrick Bryan sat on the sofa and said after some thought, "I'm Lonese. I once did business in East Balaam and nearly died because of a disease. I was rescued by members of the Numinous Episcopate, and during that ritual, I received God's grace and survived. Later, I secretly changed my faith. The faction I'm in is always being vilified by the other members of the Numinous Episcopate. They believe that we're engaging in sacrilege, that we're in a bid to create a new death. But that's not the case. We firmly believe that God didn't perish at the end of the fourth epoch. He is merely asleep and requires certain things to be done in order to awaken. The facts have proven that we were right. You are witness to this. The ancient chronicles I received didn't say so. Those high-ranking members of the Numinous Episcopate are fully aware that they are emulating the matter of the hidden sage to create artificial death. Could it be that this gentleman in front of me isn't a core member of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction? And he also lacks sufficient knowledge regarding the uniqueness? But how can a demigod not be a core member? Even if the Numinous Episcopate is a remnant of the Balaam royal family and Death's Church, with copious amounts of knowledge and powerhouses, there's no way they will let a demigod go to waste. Even the 7 Orthodox churches wouldn't do such a thing. Klein was extremely puzzled hearing this as he asked, "What about the other high-ranking members of your faction?" Patrick Bryan said with a reverent look, "When I joined the Numinous Episcopate, God had already awakened a little. This is all the work of the saints of the past. They had sacrificed themselves over the numerous rituals. Currently, we have a total of 3 saints and an angel. They are in East Balaam while I'm in charge of Backlund matters. That's not right. Based on the information provided by Leonard, the Numinous Episcopate have their members split into many small teams in Backland. They aren't aware of each other, and they only make contact with a specific person in the southern continent. There's no overall person in charge. Klein's first reaction was that Patrick Bryan was lying, but he immediately dismissed it. This was because it was something easily verifiable for a blessed who had been the focus of a revelation. He thought for a moment before he asked, "What's that angel's name? Where isn't he? Are there any other revelations?" Patrick Bryan answered frankly, "God made me not inform others, nor make inquiries to others about matters. Our leader's name is Hayter, both the last name and first name. He was once the Archbishop of the Church, and later he became an angel thanks to God's grace. He has always been working hard to awaken the sleeping God, but he was severely corrupted in one of the rituals. Currently, he is unable to leave his mausoleum, otherwise, he would directly lose control. He is considered my teacher. This demigod that has existed since the Balaam Empire is clearly key in steering the artificial death project." Klein asked in thought, "Even the other two demigods are Balamese purebloods?" "Yes." Patrick Bryan nodded. "I roughly get what's happening." Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. He believed that Patrick Bryan wasn't an ordinary demigod, but a byproduct of the artificial death project. Back then, Hayter and the other members of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction had no intention of saving Alones. Instead, they had planned on using him for a ritual sacrificial item or material. In the end, something unexpected happened during their attempt, which they originally hadn't had high hopes of. Death's uniqueness gained some level of instinct or produced other changes. This led to Patrick Bryan's survival and his establishment of a certain connection with artificial death. His spirit and body became special. Upon witnessing this, Hayter and the other high-ranking members began viewing Patrick Bryan as key to the success of the artificial death project. They gave him potions and taught him, proselytizing him with the faith of death, thus fabricating a perfect excuse for themselves. And due to Bryan's specialness, he had advanced rapidly and became a demigod. Of course, no matter how key he was merely an experimental subject. Patrick Bryan had never been treated as one of the members of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Later, he was sent to the Lund Kingdom's Backland to lead 2 or 3 teams. He did various kinds of rituals in a bid to bring the uniqueness alive. Such a guess was in line with the situation which Klein was currently aware of. First, Leonard had mentioned that the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction had placed their experiments in Backland, planning to destroy the enemy's capital even if an accident happened. Second, many teams were independently connected to the southern continent and Backland and had no overall person in charge. Third, Patrick Bryan's knowledge of artificial death was very different from reality. This also meant that the people in the southern continent didn't care for Bryan's life and death, nor did they tell him the truth. Under such circumstances, there was no other explanation unless he was a byproduct of the artificial death project. From the looks of it, the goddess's control of the uniqueness is still limited. She can only send revelations to one person who is directly connected to artificial death. She is unable to influence Hayter and the other saints. Klein reined in his thoughts and asked, "What's your current sequence?" Patrick Bryan didn't hide the truth. "I'm an undying." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 977. Klein wasn't surprised at Patrick Bryan's answer. He nodded gently and said, "Which incarnation number are you at?" Based on what he knew, Undying died once every 60 years before reviving. They would then lose most of their memories, which needed to be slowly recollected. It was like the beginning of a new life. This was knowledge that came from the potion, so Patrick Bryan easily understood what the blessed meant. He deliberated over his words and said, "I'm not 50 yet. I haven't been an Undying for more than 10 years. Klein then asked, "When did you switch faiths to our Lord?" Here, Lord referred to the Lord of the Underworld. Bryan recalled for 2 to 3 seconds before he said, "I had just celebrated my 30th birthday back then. Stepping into the world of mystery at 30 and becoming a Beyonder. becoming a sequence for demigod before 40. This speed either means shocking talent or that he's a blessed. Indeed, his spirit and body had been influenced by the death pathway's uniqueness during that ritual. As Klein listened, he became more certain of his theories from before. Of course, compared to how he had only taken a year to go from an ordinary person to a sequence for demigod, Patrick Bryan's advancement speed was nothing. On this point, Klein didn't feel that there was anything to be poignant about, because he was truly a blessed. Furthermore, he had cheats far greater than one. The only problem was that he wasn't sure if everything that he had done was enough to exchange for something. After some thought, Klein asked, "What's your current public identity?" "I'm a businessman. I have 2 garment factories in Backland. On the surface, I believe in the Evernight goddess and am a supporter of the new party." Patrick Bryan introduced himself. Klein nearly let out a scoff as he continued, "How many Numinous Episcopate members do you have under you? What are they doing?" "Already prepared," Bryan answered eloquently, 2 teams, a total of 12 beyond us. Some of them are working at my garment factory while others are in the watch and clock industry. All of them have their own formal occupations. Typically, they will be careful when proselytizing to the people around them. The progress on this is very slow, nor is it the main goal. We do not have more than 100 believers. Most of the time, they are searching for clues that God had left behind, as well as the different materials needed for the awakening ritual. With clues in hand, we will carry out operations. And once the materials are gathered, we will experiment in different awakening rituals and seek out the most effective one. I'm the main person behind this operation, and am also core to the rituals. You sound pretty proud of that. Klein asked about other matters and received detailed answers. Finally, he thought for a moment before saying with a stern expression, "In accordance with the revelation from God, you are to heed my instructions from this moment forth." Patrick Bryan immediately got up and gave a solemn bow. "Yes, Your Excellency." Klein nodded slightly and answered, "First, stop all rituals and stop gathering materials. God has already partially awakened. He is in his recovery stage, so he isn't to be disturbed by noise." Updated chapters on novelbin.com. From Klein's point of view, regardless of the changes in Bryan's awakening rituals, they were ultimately pointed at artificial death, the death pathway's uniqueness. This would only increase its chances of coming to life, making it disadvantageous for the goddess to deepen her control over it. And regardless if Klein was happy for this to happen or not, since the Evernight goddess had assigned Bryan to him, he had to make such arrangements. Patrick Bryan had zero doubts toward his explanation, because death had indeed awoken, and awakening rituals were, in essence, a form of disturbance. This undying thought before asking, "Your Excellency, what should we do next?" Klein smiled with approbation. "Continue seeking out clues for things that God left behind. This will aid in his recovery." Upon saying that, Klein originally had a second request, but he was worried that there were too few clues to it, making it possible for the Numinous Episcopate members to stir up trouble with nothing to be done. He added, "In addition, promote reading to all those around you and your subordinates, be it at the garment factory or elsewhere. Establish night schools or learning classes. Let the people around you extricate themselves from ignorance and savagery." To make it more convincing, Klein stretched out his right hand and pressed it to his chest. With abnormal piousness, he began preaching, "God said one needs to understand the belief to believe. God said that to those who are lost, one has to first strengthen their body and arm his brain. This is because the kingdom he promises is one without ignorance and savagery." Patrick Bryan didn't doubt Dwayne Dantes' words, nor did he find it strange that such records weren't found in the Numinous Episcopate's Bible. This was because this person before him was God's blessed, a representative appointed by God. He earnestly nodded. "I will heed God's teachings. May every spirit gain eternal life in God's kingdom." As he said that, he used the praying gesture that the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction used. It was to raise both hands high, thumbs facing each other as he held them at his forehead. In mysticism theory, this was the core to the underworld contained in every gatekeeper. It represented death's position. Klein returned with the same gesture and words before saying, "Second, orders from the southern continent, no matter who it comes from, has to be handed to me first. They can be done only after I give permission. If no permission is given, you are not to do it in private. You can only give feedback based on what I say." This was because he was worried that Hater, the angel of the death domain, would still remain fervent about the artificial death plan, occasionally instructing Brian and the others to make new attempts. Meanwhile, he also had to ensure that Hater and the other two saints wouldn't notice anything amiss before the goddess gained a deeper control over the death pathway's uniqueness. He needed to prevent them from doing anything excessive. Brian had no objections on this matter. "Yes, Your Excellency." After giving instructions on the two most important matters, Klein wore the same expression, but he inwardly felt relieved. He said after some deliberation, "Third, unless convened by me, do not seek me out. Our usual communications shall be completed via messengers. As you know, there are many existences in the astral world who do not wish to see God return." Patrick Brian nodded heavily. "I understand. My messenger's summoning incantation is spirit wandering above the world, absolutely friendly creature, Patrick Brian's contract companion. Indeed, it's impossible for a demigod of the death pathway to not have a messenger. Normally, sequence 6 beyonders of this pathway should have one." Klein didn't hesitate as he answered in an unhurried tone, "Remember, my messenger's summoning incantation is the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the messenger that belongs to German Sparrow. Oh, be it receiving or sending mail, a gold coin needs to be paid to complete the transaction." Klein deliberately revealed that German Sparrow and Dwayne Dantes were related in order to determine Brian's reaction. "German Sparrow?" Patrick Brian repeated the name in puzzlement before coming to an enlightened state. He exclaimed in pleasant surprise, "Your Excellency, Deaf Consul?" Thankfully, although he's a byproduct of a ritual and is fervently zealous, he has normal intelligence. He can consciously seek out information and do an analysis. Klein exhaled in relief and replied with a smile, "I'm not him. It is my teacher." Brian nodded in thought, believing that he had fully understood the entire matter. Klein guessed at his thoughts, but ignored it. Crossing his right leg, he placed both hands on his knee and asked, "What do you know about the other factions of the Numinous Episcopate?" Patrick Brian sat down again and said, "The Numinous Episcopate's strongest faction is the Royal Family faction. With God's descendants as the core, they have established many organizations. Their leader is currently a descendant with a relatively thin bloodline. Her name is Sia Palenkegas. She might be an angel or wields an important relic of God. She calls herself Pale White Empress. Other than her, the Royal Family faction had 5 other saint apostles. Some of them are true demigods, while others rely on sealed artifacts. Other than the Royal Family faction and us, the other factions are relatively weaker. The main ones are the Repose faction and the Underworld faction. Only by working together do they have 3 powerful Beyonders who are equivalent to the Saint Apostles." After Brian finished, Klein nodded indiscernibly. "That's it for today. If there's anything in the future, feel free to contact me." "Yes, Your Excellency." Patrick Brian stood up and bowed before leaving the room. The door silently opened as the figure outside slinked into the shadows and disappeared with the cold wind. After everything calmed down, Klein glanced at the door that had closed. He walked to the window, drew the curtains, and looked towards the street. There were a few carriages there at some point in time. Each of them had 2 lanterns hanging in front of them. Their lights were abnormally pale white with a tinge of dark green. They illuminated the surroundings into a blur. Nearly transparent figures surrounded this blurry scene. They were wearing illusory clothes that appeared like formal wear, making them appear rather formal. After Patrick Brian landed from midair and returned, the figures bowed and attentively followed the demigod and the spirit beside him onto the hardly visible carriages. Then they steered into the distance. The pale white light with tinges of dark green grew faint and finally vanished into the darkness as though it had never arrived. Klein looked away and muttered to himself with a solemn expression. Although the revelation received by Patrick Bryan stems from the goddess and her considerations, I have a nagging feeling that there's something dark and sinister about to break out in Backland or even the entire world. I wonder when it will stir up some waves. With this in mind, Klein didn't delay a second. He immediately contacted Demoness Trissy to confirm that nothing abnormal had happened to her. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 978. On a night with clear moonlight, in the garden of 160 Beauclun Street, a grey rat crawled out of its hole, running straight for the master bedroom's bed. As a tiny, black, glue-like blob object floated down, the rat held it over its head like an acrobatic act. It quickly turned around, ran out of 160 Beauclun Street, and headed for the sewer entrance. At this moment, the grey rat raised its torso up and reached out with two of its paws. They magically extended as blobs of flesh appeared on its forelimbs. Then, using its mutated front paws, it moved the manhole cover away without causing a sound. Without stopping at all, the grey rat headed straight down the sewers, going all the way to the spot where Demoness Trissy previously hid. It kept digging in a corner until it excavated a mirror fragment from the soil. Having done that, the grey rat threw the black, sticky object over its head to the side where it was relatively clean. It then retreated to a corner, allowing its body to stretch and turn into a middle-aged man wearing a dark red coat and a triangular hat. He was none other than Admiral of Blood, who had previously been active at sea. However, this seigneur, along with his clothes and body, was just a thin layer, akin to a figurine cut from paper. This rat is quite fat. Admiral of Blood stroked his chin, but his paper figurine-like body nearly flew up as a result of the cold draft in the sewers. The person who spoke was none other than Klein. He was inside his master bedroom, turning a rat into his marionette by controlling its spirit body threads. He then made it carry the ritual materials and head down the sewers to contact Demoness Trissy. Seigneur, whose arms were flailing about due to the draft, bent down and picked up the sticky blob. This was the remains of Trissy's lock of hair after she burned it with black flames. It could be used for a communication ritual. Right on the heels of that, he wiped the mirror fragment clean and smeared the material onto it. After this step, Klein made his marionette take 2 steps back from the mirror. With a smacking sound, Seigneur was plastered to the mossy wall like an oil painting. East Borough. In a room with thick curtains that left it almost dark. Raven-black, slimy tentacles coiled together, forming a huge sphere. And at the end of these tentacles, there were either eyes with clear blacks and whites embedded in them, or there were venomous snake heads attached there. The latter opened their mouths slightly as they shot out their tongues in a rather strange fashion. It was quite a harrowing scene. Suddenly, they flailed up or retracted as the sphere crumbled, layer after layer. Enveloped in the middle of a sphere was a curled-up girl. She had abnormally sweet looks, but her brows were tightly furrowed. Her expression looked slightly warped due to the pain, a look that stirred up one's sense of pity. The slimy and disgusting tentacles retracted and shrank, finally turning back into their original formed strands of raven-black hair. The expression of the girl with soft, long hair soothed as she slowly got up and walked to the side of a tiny bed she had partitioned out. Picking up the sleeping gown that had fallen to the ground, she draped it over her. Then, she curled her black hair and came in front of the full-body mirror. Reaching out her right hand, she swiped across it. A black flame burst forth as it burned quietly in the air before being extinguished. It left behind a mirror that had turned dark and profound. In the mirror, light drifted and rapidly presented the sewers filled with dirty slush. Thinly plastered to the wall was a middle-aged man with an old triangular hat and dark red coat. He was looking down on the girl across an unknown distance, like a famous painting. The girl with the round face and thin eyes watched in silence before laughing. As her smile bloomed, the dark room seemed to instantly brighten. She then lightly opened her mouth and said in jest, "Mr. German Sparrow, is this your craziness and cruelty as the strongest adventurer? Or is it the case where I'm only acquainted with a clown?" Klein wasn't surprised that Trissy had recognized him as German Sparrow. After all, he had previously met her in the image of Admiral of Blood Seigneur, and this pirate admiral had long been hunted by German Sparrow. Back then, Trissy was hiding in the sewers due to an injury and was focused on revenge, preventing her from being kept abreast of the news at sea. It was rather unsurprising for her to be unaware of Admiral of Blood's demise, but things were different after she finished recuperating and left the area. She would have been a terrible assassin and instigator if she hadn't investigated her partner. Clearly, Triss's past actions indicated that, despite being evil, it didn't discount her intelligence. Klein didn't argue as he controlled the paper figurine-like Senor to smile and simply reply, "Why can't clowns be crazy and cruel?" Without waiting for Triss's answer, he said, "Any progress on your investigations into the captain of the Royal Guards?" Triss's expression turned slightly gloomy as she said, "It will need another month at the very least for any results. It might even take 2. If you need help, you can seek me out," Klein emphasized again. Trissy scoffed and said, "In Backland, in this game, strength isn't able to resolve every problem. Of course, I've never wasted the opportunity to use others. Mr. German Sparrow, since there's no need to hide your identity, can you give me a more convenient method of contact? Why do I feel like I'm being asked to give my cell phone number?" Klein thought about it for a moment before informing her of the incantation to summoning Miss Messenger, as well as the important ritual ingredient of 1 gold coin. Trissy didn't speak further. Reaching out her right hand, she tapped on the mirror's surface. The black flames burst before disappearing, restoring the full-body mirror to normal. In the sewers, Senor buried the mirror fragment back into the soil and made his body shrink rapidly, turning back into a grey rat. It then ran deep into the sewers, allowing itself to be fed by carnivores. Back in 160 Beauclun Street, Klein drew his curtains and returned to the reclining chair. To be frank, he regretted cooperating with Trissy. He felt that she was burdened by some will of the primordial demoness and was reckless for revenge. She was like a ticking bomb that might explode at any moment. If Trissy were to mutate, it's highly possible that she would create a terrifying disaster. I shouldn't have spared her back then. Klein sighed and began setting up a ritual. He sent the black blob above the grey fog and attempted to divination Triss's present location and recent condition. 20 to 30 seconds later, he was met with failure. This only worried him more because such an outcome implied that Trissy had become a blessed of the primordial demoness to a certain extent. The next afternoon, Klein, who had had breakfast, began instructing butler Walter and the newly appointed butler assistant, Richardson, to deliver the gifts he had brought from the southern continent. This filled an entire luggage bag, of which included Fermo coffee beans, East Balam tobacco, River Valley's great wine, and human bone sculptures. They were to be gifted to the different neighbors around the neighborhood as a sign of goodwill from Dwayne Dantes. It was also to announce his return to the social scene. Oh yes, remember to mention to Member of Parliament Marked or his wife that this bottle of River Valley great wine is suitable for making cocktails. It's best matched with lemon juice, Klein exhorted Walter. Particular care was needed in gifting others. It had to take into account the receiver's preferences, and obviously, the most popular product of the southern continent at present, Donningsman hair tonic, wasn't suitable as a gift, as it would only appear to be a veiled attempt at ridicule. Walter solemnly nodded and said, "Yes, sir." After receiving no more instructions from his employer, Richardson glanced at the remaining pile of gifts and asked, "Where will they be sent to?" "This is for the staff of the Bursary Foundation." "I'll deliver it myself," Klein said with a smile. Check new novel chapters at novelbin.com. He then pointed at the golden amulet in his hand and said, "I missed the birth of Dr. Aaron's child, so I'll need to express my apologies in person. I'll head over in the afternoon and plan on gifting this amulet with southern continent characteristics to that child. Of course, as a baby, Will or Septin series probably won't like it. Compared to this, I'll just call him. He would rather have ice cream." Klein grumbled inwardly after answering Richardson. After the butler and Richardson left, bringing gifts and male servants to the different neighbors, Klein got into his carriage and headed straight for the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation at 22 Phelps Street. After alighting, he headed forward with his valet, Inuni, carrying plenty of gifts behind him. Along the way, he greeted and gifted any members of the staff he saw. Soon, Klein arrived at the second story and arrived at one of the director's office. He knocked gently on the door. "Please come in." Audrey Hall's gentle voice sounded. As a rather senior spectator, she had already noticed that Mr. Dwayne Dantes had come to the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. She had been patiently waiting for him. Klein pushed the door and entered, taking out a small gift box from his inner pocket before saying with a warm smile, "I've returned from the southern continent. Well, my business went very smoothly. I brought some gifts for everyone, hoping to share my happiness with everyone." He had specially mentioned this to indicate to Miss Justice that he remembered her request. "You leave me no reason to decline it," Audrey said with an expectant smile. This didn't mean that she cared for the gift Mr. World gave, but more a result of being curious as to what Mr. World would give. After receiving the gift box, she tore open the wrapping in front of Dwayne Dantes and discovered an accessory with a white feather adorned with pale yellow patterns as its highlight. "This is a decorative ribbon," Klein explained. "People of certain social standing in East Balam will enjoy wearing items with such white feathers on various parts of their body. Out of all the places, it's considered most noble and meaningful to attach it to a hat. This is said to be a tradition from the worship of feathered serpents." Feathered serpents are symbols for death over there. And the feather he got a Southern Continent craftsman to craft into the hat was a byproduct of the Artificial Death Project. It could be sacrificed. Klein had once obtained 3 of them. He had used one in Bayam by using the copper whistle messenger and summoning the mutated monster, which was corrupted by artificial death. The other was sacrificed to artificial death in the southern continent, allowing him to receive the revelation of Int Zangwal being possessed by an evil spirit. This was the last feather. As the present artificial death was equivalent to the Evernite goddess to a certain extent, Klein, who was clearly a blessed, didn't need to carry out such acts in subsequent rituals. He could use other materials to replace the feather, so he decided to turn the remaining one into a gift for Miss Justice. After all, she was also a believer of Evernite, and she might be able to contact artificial death at some critical moment. Audrey held her present with a smile as she silently listened to Dwayne Dantes' description. For some baffling reason, an idea flashed in her mind. Don't tell me Mr. World really plucked a feathered serpent's feather for this hat. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 979. The traditions in the southern continent are really different from ours. Audrey looked down at the feathered cap in the gift box as she marveled, but it's in line with my taste. The latter half of her sentence was partially genuine and partially out of politeness. On the one hand, she found the processed feather akin to a piece of artwork, and on the other hand, she found its style too obvious and extreme. It wasn't something she would use as an accessory. This was akin to how others would have their interest piqued by items with unique and mysterious patterns when visiting ancient ruins. They would be filled with praise over it, but they would seldom purchase similar items to place it at home or use it as an accessory. Klein smiled in response. There are also many stark differences amongst the southern continent traditions. It's almost completely different in East Balam from the highlands and river valley. Of course, they also have their similarities, such as their adoration of gold. They believe that this metal possesses magical powers. As he said that, he pointed at the feather in Audrey's hand. Legend has it that people who wear such accessories would receive the blessings of the feathered serpent, or in other words, death. He was hinting to Audrey about how she could use the feather. As a sequence 6 of the spectator pathway, Audrey easily read in between the lines. She understood that the hat accessory allowed her to receive a response from the so-called death at critical moments, bringing about certain effects. As for how she should use it, it was basic knowledge in mysticism. Audrey had a solid foundation and didn't require Mr. Dwayne Dantes to explain in detail. She faintly smiled without revealing her teeth and said, "I really like it. I will attach it to my hat in appropriate situations." Not bad. It's so easy talking to spectators. Klein returned with a smile and pointed at the door. "I still have presents to hand out." "You will be the most welcomed person here today," Audrey replied with a smile, a euphemistic way of expressing her gratitude. Meanwhile, she was a little vexed. She was hesitant about finding an opportunity to inform Mr. World, who had been embroiled in Kuaron suicide, about Havin Rambais. He had shown some deep interest and importance on the matter. Oh, it's almost Monday. I'll leave it until the tarot gathering. It will be much easier to communicate when the time comes. I can also seek advice from Mr. Hanged Man and Hermit on how to deal with my current situation, especially the problem of being wary against the cues and hypnotism from a high-sequence beyonder. After all, I can't always pray to Mr. Fool ahead of time to receive an angel's blessing. On careful thought, such a form of hypnotism is truly terrifying. Carrying out instructions without realizing it. Audrey's mind was awash with thoughts as they bubbled. This made her suspect that many people in Baklan's high society had been hypnotized, acting in ways that violated their true intentions and will. In addition, she also came to realize something. Every time her parents attended Mass at St. Samuel Cathedral, the one in charge of the rites was definitely Baklan's archbishop. And to hold such a post, he was definitely a demigod of the Church of Evernight. At times, His Grace will even visit in person to chat with us. This is to prevent such matters from happening? That's why Havin Rambais' hypnosis effect on me didn't go overboard? Audrey watched as Dwayne Dantes left her office. After closing the door and sitting down at her desk, she picked up a fountain pen and mindlessly scribbled on it. After she reined in her thoughts, the piece of white paper was filled with interlocking circles. There was a face with cold eyes and scattered lines. At a glance, Audrey tensed up. She immediately used her spirituality and the friction between items to ignite the paper, turning it to ashes. Her random drawing had, in a sense, reflected her true emotions and thoughts. And to a good psychiatrist, interpreting such pictures was a basic skill. Therefore, Audrey hadn't left any traces behind. After a while, Klein delivered all his gifts and chatted with a few directors along the way. Finally, he entered a room meant for part-time directors like him to rest. He found a pen and paper, sat on the sofa, and began writing after some thought. Dear Mr. Azik. While in the southern continent, Klein had written about Adam's obtaining of 0-08, his successful revenge on Int Zangwill with the help of Leonard and Daly. He then summoned the messenger via the copper whistle and sent it to the sleeping Mr. Azik. Without a doubt, he had yet to receive a reply to date. Klein wasn't worried about mentioning Adam and 0-08 in the letter because the Angel of Imagination definitely knew about his relationship with Mr. Azik. And sharing matters he encountered with someone familiar wouldn't garner any excessive reaction. This time, Klein's letter didn't involve anything extraordinary. With a smile and gentle scribble, he shared the details about the Bursary Foundation which he learned from Audrey and the other directors. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "This is a really meaningful matter. I feel satisfied and happy about it. Mr. Azik, would you feel the same? When you awaken, perhaps you can attempt to do something similar. Every time you revive, you would be able to see the children who had received your help in the past. When that happens, although they might not remember them, they will definitely remember you." After finishing the letter and putting down the fountain pen, Klein carefully read it once, and after confirming that there weren't any problems, he blew the copper whistle, summoned the skeleton messenger, and allowed it to take the letter away. Following that, he left the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation with his valet, Inunai. He came to the nearby St. Samuel Cathedral and silently prayed for 15 minutes in the serene and dark prayer hall. Like before, Klein came to the donation box and threw a stack of cash in, a total of £80. Taking this opportunity, he found Bishop Electra and had a chat with him and listened to his sermon. This also announced to the Church of Dwayne Dantes' return. As for presents, Klein didn't directly give it since he was inside the Goddess's Cathedral. Instead, Butler Walter would naturally deliver his gifts to the bishop's residences in private. Fin new chapters on no/elbinin.com. At tea time in the afternoon, Klein followed his schedule and left 160 Beauclun Street and headed to Dr. Aaron's for a visit. Richardson had already informed them in the morning and had received permission to visit. This time, Klein not only met Dr. Aaron Series, but he also met his wife, Wilma Gladys, as well as the newborn and his elder brothers and sisters who were a few years older. What a pity that I wasn't able to participate in, Klein deliberated, paused, and successfully waited for Wilma Gladys to reply. Will with a smile. He reorganized his words and said, "Unfortunately, I was unable to participate in Will's birthday party because of my trip to East Balaam. This is an amulet that's rather popular over there. It brings children good luck." As he said that, he handed the golden accessory to Dr. Aaron. Aaron Series wasn't a man who was good with words. He accepted it without declining it and nodded. "Thank you." Following that, he held the string and hung the golden amulet into the pram beside him. Shaking it, he asked, "Will, do you like it?" Wrapped in silver silk, the chubby baby raised his arm, swung it, and flicked the golden amulet away. Flicked away. The mood instantly turned a little awkward in the activity room. Klein chuckled and broke the silence. This is a reaction all kids have. At this moment, a maid had delivered the 3-layered tray for high tea, allowing the hosts and the guests to switch topics of conversation, allowing the mood to return to normal. As Klein drank his black tea and ate the pastry, he began talking about all kinds of interesting customs in East and West Balaam. It left the couple and their 2 other children intrigued as they would question him from time to time. During this process, Klein suddenly turned to face the pram and asked with a smile, "You don't seem to enjoy my present." As he spoke, nothing abnormal happened to the couple and the rest of the people in the activity room as they continued wearing attentive looks. In the illusion Klein created, he hadn't finished his recount. Will Orseptin, who had fleshy arms, scoffed as he said with a childlike voice, "What's the point in having such gifts? You might as well give me Gwaedar. At the very least, that can be drunk." Klein smiled as he shook his head and said, "I have some news for you. Ouroboros was injured by a particular person and will likely not be able to continue seeking you out for the time being." He didn't dare mention Adam's name or title. He didn't even think about it, afraid that the leader of the Twilight Hermit Order would notice it, thus discovering Snake of Fate Will Orseptin's location. As for a description like Amon's brother, Klein had temporarily avoided using it. He had no idea if Amon was still in Backland and if the frequent mention of the Angel of Time's name would result in a crossing of fate. However, Klein believed that the Snake of Fate was likely to guess who had injured the Angel of Fate. This was because the only ones who remained active in the real world and were of a higher level than Ouroboros were limited to Amon and Adam. He had used the words particular person to eliminate the possibility of the assumption of the besieging of several angels or the use of Grade O sealed artifacts. Will Orseptin fell silent for a moment and said, "I did tell you that the deviation in your fate is a good thing in the long term." After exchanging information, Klein was about to dispel the illusion when he suddenly heard Will Orseptin quip, "Oh, I suddenly have a craving for Gwaedar, especially if it's iced. Such beverages aren't good for a baby." Klein wore a serious look as he dispelled the illusion, reaching out his hand to receive the cup of ice cream a maid had delivered. Then, under Aaron's and Wilma's watch, he scooped some ice cream with the silver spoon and teased the baby with a smile. "Will, do you want some? Do you want some?" Wilma immediately chuckled. "Our Will doesn't enjoy that." Just as she said that, Klein stuffed the spoon of ice cream into his mouth. "Wah!" The baby in the pram immediately let out a loud cry. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 980. After some placating, Aaron Series and Wilma Gladys finally managed to calm down the baby. Phew. The thin and tall Aaron heaved a sigh of relief and got up. Nudging his gold-rimmed glasses, he nodded at his guest with an apologetic look. After organizing his words for a few seconds, he said, "Sorry about that. Children are often like this." "Indeed." Klein smiled in reply, indicating that he didn't mind it one bit. Following that, he changed the topic of conversation and continued sharing his experiences in East and West Balaam. During this process, he made use of his Beyonder powers once more, making everyone in the activity room fall under the effects of an illusion. Then, he picked up the ice cream which he hadn't finished, changed the spoon and got up with a smile. Walking to the pram, he asked gently, "Will, do you want some?" Without waiting for the chubby fellow wrapped in silver silk to reply, he said with a gentle tone, "You're born now and should be able to fold a paper crane. This way, I don't have to visit often." You should know how suspicious it is. Will Orceptin Ceres glared at him without giving him a reply. Klein didn't flinch as he took out a piece of high-quality paper and placed it in the pram. Then, he bent down, scooping out some ice cream. A price is always exacted for what fate bestows, isn't it? Klein chuckled as he swished the spoon in his hand. In the pram, Will raised his left hand, wiping the tears that hadn't dried from his face, and mumbled, for beyond us of the fate pathway, the exacted price needs to be paid first before awaiting bestowment. With that said, the chubby baby grabbed the piece of paper and folded a paper crane with great difficulty. Klein stood in front of the pram and maintained the stability of the spoon, watching this scene with a smile. A carriage set off from Pinster Street and headed for St. Samuel Cathedral. While passing by 160 Beauclun Street, Leonard Mitchell looked out the window and seemingly muttered to himself, "Dwayne Dantes is back as well." The slightly aged voice rang out in his mind. Fate will ultimately intertwine. Old man, you're becoming more of a charlatan after you woke up. Leonard couldn't help but mock. Pallas Zoroas chuckled without a reply. After coming to St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard entered the study of Backlund's Archbishop, St. Anthony, under a priest's lead. Anthony Stevenson was wearing a black robe with red hues. His eyes were deep and his face clean-shaven. Standing by a cupboard, the shadow created seemed like an unknown existence that observed everything from the darkness. It stirred fear into anyone. "Your Grace, you summoned me?" Although Leonard had already anticipated it, he still bowed in a rather lacking manner. Anthony nodded gently and said, "You have already rendered enough services to apply to become a Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock. However, you haven't finished digesting the Soul Assurer potion, therefore, I'll be extracting you out of Soist's team and assigning you some separate missions." Leonard replied, "As per protocol, I am at your command." Anthony picked up a stack of papers on his desk and said, "These are cases with suspected paranormal activity. You are to investigate each case, mainly placating or purifying them. If you require additional assistance, you can select members from the Nighthawks team of each area of jurisdiction." "Yes, Your Grace." Leonard would have done similar tasks even if St. Anthony hadn't instructed him to do so. Therefore, he had zero objections toward such an assignment. After receiving the stack of papers, he casually flipped through it and said, "Your Grace, what's Captain Soist's team busy with at present?" He had been focused on revenge over the past half-year, making himself appear desultory and insular. This prevented him from building strong friendships with the Red Gloves teammates, but despite that, they were teammates who he had fought alongside with. He couldn't help but be concerned for them. They have been assigned to help Crestit finish a mission. Anthony Stevenson didn't answer in detail. His Excellency Sesamir is also in Backlund. Leonard didn't ask further as he gestured for points across his chest in a clockwise fashion. "May the goddess bless everyone. Praise the lady." Anthony did the same gesture. After leaving the Archbishop's study, Leonard headed down to the basement. He wanted to find a quiet room and list down his upcoming mission and run through them in the assigned order. Midway while walking down the stairs, he subconsciously looked at the stained windows above him. The sunlight was shining in, making the artwork made from the stained windows look even more solemn. It also accentuated the tiny bugs and dust that floated in midair. Upon seeing this scene, Leonard suddenly recalled Old Man's description of Amorn. He had the inexplicable feeling that the blasphemer was everywhere. He trembled inwardly as a thought came to him. He quickly asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, I have a question." "What is it?" Pallas Zoroast asked slowly. Leonard asked with a suppressed voice, "Back then, why didn't you parasitize a bug? They're smaller and more concealed. You can easily hide in cathedrals without being worried that Amorn would discover you." Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. How long can a bug live? Continuously switching parasitic targets is extremely burdensome on the body. This way, not only will recovery not be possible by parasitizing it, but it will even worsen one's condition and shorten one's lifespan, Pallas Zoroast harumphed and said. Leonard was somewhat enlightened as he pressed, "What about other creatures?" those that live relatively longer lives and can enter a cathedral without being noticed. Pallas Zoroast immediately chortled before saying, "From the looks of it, you haven't kept what I've said to heart. This will only serve to make you suffer in the future. The higher the sequence is, the greater the inclinations towards losing control is, and the more madness accumulates. This is a trait of the characteristics, and it can only be resisted and suppressed. There's no way to eliminate it. Therefore, for a parasite, choosing a target for parasitizing requires one to consider these aspects. If one were to parasitize ordinary animals, it's still all right for short periods of time, but once it goes on for too long, one will suffer the effects of the body's construct and hormones. Everything is reciprocal, isn't it? A parasite can influence the target, but so can the target influence a parasite. When one parasitizes an ordinary animal, it's necessary to frequently talk to someone to avoid forgetting one's former identity. This way, the chances of exposure is extremely high, and if one doesn't do that, the host will definitely influence the parasite, causing them to lose the ability to speak. It will muddle one's own existence until one doesn't know he is. It would then result in madness and with the loss of control crushing the parasite. Leonard was left alarmed as he nodded slightly. I understand. It's no wonder you are so strict on choosing a parasitic target. Are you trying to praise yourself? Pallas Zoroast scared. To us, the best parasitic target is undoubtedly beyond us of the same pathway. All aspects will be synchronized, and by nurturing them one sequence at a time, they can be made as replenishments for one's beyonder powers. It would be the best medicine and a potential option for taking over the body. Upon hearing Old Man speak of such vile and terrifying matters so calmly, Leonard frowned slightly as he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. This meant that Old Man wouldn't do the same to him. Pallas Zoroast continued, the second best choice would be beyond us from the seer or apprentice pathways. The absorption of their powers wouldn't incur too much a burden on the parasite, allowing them to quickly recover. The next choice would then be smart beyond us of other pathways. At the very least, communication would be good and cooperation would be possible. As for you, Leonard was just about to retort Old Man when he suddenly saw a bishop walking down from above. He hurriedly shut his mouth, held onto the railings, and sped up his pace. 7:30 in the evening, 39 Beauclun Street, Member of Parliament Mark's house. Dressed in a tailcoat, Klein got off a carriage as he buttoned his clothes. Under the lit fountain's illumination, he entered the foyer and met Maury Marked, who was dressed in an olive-green military uniform with an orange-red sash across his waist. His chest was covered with medals, accolades of his achievements in war. His wife, Rihanna, was wearing a shoulder-exposing dress. She greeted Dwayne Dantes with a smile, "Welcome, our traveler. Everyone has been waiting for you to share your experiences at Balan this time. Should I launch a travel column at a newspaper company?" Klein replied with a joke. Mark knew that Dwayne Dantes had headed for Southern Continent to do business. Furthermore, it was a business he kick-started. Therefore, after exchanging a smile, he came close and gave him a hug, suppressing his voice by saying, "Well done." Klein smiled with a nod and asked, "Do you like the present?" He was referring to the bottle of River Valley grape wine that could be made into a sour cocktail. It was excellent. I still fondly recall the taste, Mark said earnestly. Klein was about to enter the hall when he noticed something amiss. He did a cursory glance and asked out of puzzlement, "Miss Hazel isn't in? Has she been sent to study at an all-girls public school?" Rihanna sighed as she shook her head. "No, she's only sick. She'll head for public school only in September." "She caught a cold?" Klein expressed the concern a guest should have. Mark said with a helpless smile, "No, she was bitten by a rabid rat when she was at the manor in the outskirts. Her wound hasn't healed completely yet." Hazel got bitten by a rabid rat. Klein nodded in thought. "Did she see a doctor?" "Oh, has that rat been caught?" "The doctor gave her an injection to prevent any infections," Mark said simply. "That rat still hasn't been found. Perhaps we need to rear a few more cats in the manor."